Hello everyone and welcome back to the Cosmic Convention, the Pickles Parker Podcast where we talk about the greatest show in the galaxy, Doctor Who. Now today I'm joined with the first proper guest of this series, because obviously episode 1 I was with my friend Max, but today we've got actually someone who I've never really spoken to before, but I imagine most of you watching this video know who he is, either from YouTube or Twitter. He's very active in the Doctor Who community. It's MrTARDISreviews. Say hello.
Hi, this is Mr. TARDIS here. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm flattered that I could be the first guest of this podcast that you reached out. I really appreciate it.
Thank you as well for coming on. I know I said this while we weren't recording, but obviously it's very cool that you've come on, because on my channel it's only really ever been me. I've done a couple of collaborations with just like friends and stuff, but I've never really done anything with anyone, like any other Doctor YouTubers. So I guess that was one of the main reasons I wanted to do this podcast, is just to talk to different people and talk to a lot of people who I watch and I know from the Doctor Who community, to just have a chat, because I don't really know many people in my personal life who actually like Doctor Who. It's not particularly popular at like school and things, so I'm just kind of talking to like my parents, or it's the same few people essentially, and I imagine some of them are getting a bit sick of it. So it's great to talk to different people, and I guess it's just great having you on, because I've been watching you for ages and quite an inspiration. You were one of the people I kind of looked up to when I originally started the channel, because obviously, why I started the channel, I did it because I'd watched a lot of content creators, Doctor Who content creators, and thought, why not I jump on? And obviously you were one of the main ones. Especially when I first started watching Doctor Who YouTube channels, you were one of the first ones I kind of stumbled across, so it's really cool to be speaking to you now. And as I said, thanks for coming on, it's great.
No problem. Yeah, well, the reason I started was because it was after I finished at college, was before I started university, and I didn't really know many people in my personal life who was talking about or was engaging with Doctor Who. So that was one reason that I started the channel. I was talking to a lot of people about it during secondary school. This was like David Tennant's Torchwood era of the show.
That was kind of like the glory days of its popularity, whereas now it's definitely not so popular. I'd say.
I think you can, like with any circle that you go to, it does depend on your personal life and everything and who you interact with.
I was just going to say, I certainly know a lot of people that you get the usual where people say like, oh, I stopped watching after David Tennant, or I stopped watching after Matt Smith, that kind of thing. I don't really know. I know a couple of people, but I don't know an amazing amount of people who actively still watch the show now. Which I guess it's a shame. Obviously, people fade away from things. That's natural, and obviously I guess it's kind of what makes you a fan is how long you continue your interest in something. It's what makes you from just a viewer to a fan, I guess, which is how we're all in the situation today, is if we've watched Doctor Who and we've never really looked back. So
yeah, I think it's also the type of show where you can dip in and out of it with different doctors or different showrunners. So people can stop watching after David Tennant leaves, but then come back when Peter Capaldi is announced as the Doctor. I think it's a show that you can enjoy in waves and cycles, and the show will hopefully be there when you're ready to return.
Absolutely. There's no other show like it that kind of self-reboots itself every few years in universe. It's a very odd concept, I suppose. There is no other show like it. I guess that's why this show is still here today, because if it wasn't changing, it would have been gone after 3 series of William Hartnell. So it's great that it still can self-reboot it, and even though I may not be the biggest fan of certain decisions they make over its history in terms of trying to freshen it up, it's just great to acknowledge that it can do that, and it can really be anything it wants to be. Doctor Who, I suppose, that, like I said, there is no TV show or just anything like it, I'd say.
Yeah, and as a result, that also makes it one of the most complex and strange fandoms to be a part of as well.
Absolutely.
Like you'll Like, you'll have people who are so passionate about the show who have been watching it for 40, 50, nearly 60 years, but you'll also have people who can be equally passionate about it who have maybe only been watching for 2 or 3 years. That doesn't make like one form of being a fan is not necessarily better or more valid than the other, but it also means that sometimes you can have very heated discussions and things like that about the show, because people come to it from so many different vantage points.
Absolutely, is because I was talking, obviously, I mentioned in my first podcast to my friend Max, and I've seen a fair amount of classic Doctor Who, and he hasn't seen any classic Doctor Who, but we still had a great discussion, and we were kind of on the same wavelength, so it's certainly you can come at the show from any point, and you could have watched any amount of it, and you're still a fan, as long as you can have that discussion. If you have just a general interest in Doctor Who, regardless of whatever era or how much of it or anything, you're a fan. I guess you don't get that with other TV shows, like, just generally, you won't get many TV shows or just general things where people say, I was really a fan of that specific era of the show, or, I like this, and this. Generally, with a lot of TV shows, you either like the whole of it, or you don't really like it at all. Whereas Doctor Who, I guess, it is so long and it is so different in practically every single respect every few years that it is a very odd TV show, I suppose, and there is no other TV show like it, because when obviously people talk about viewing figures, or if Doctor Who should end, or when would be the right time for the show to end, or all these sorts of questions, if that was any other TV show, it would be a very logical explanation, especially how TV is made now with, the continuous narrative format which is popular today. There's obviously a very clear and definitive point of when a show should end, when that story naturally reaches its conclusion. But with Doctor Who, there is no way, or there would never be any satisfying way to try and end the show. It can just keep on going on forever.
Yeah, it's like some of the final words of the Russell T Davies era. This song is ending, but the story never ends.
Exactly,
and that's what kind of makes Doctor Who so unique. But what you add on top of that, I don't know any personally, but I'm certain there's at least one person in the world who got introduced to Doctor Who through the Class spin-off. And that was their gateway. I don't know who that person is.
I've never really thought
I would
of
have
that
not
before,
met them.
That is true.
But yeah, maybe you've got some fans out there who only watched Torchwood. Maybe there are some kids out there who only watched the Sarah Jane Adventures, and maybe only tuned in to the show when they knew she was coming back in, like, Stolen Earth and things like that. I'm sure these fans exist out there.
Absolutely.
It's such an interesting, complex fandom. Even if I'm sure maybe these people do not exist, but they could exist. The show is built in a way that could happen.
Absolutely, you are correct. Like, I guess I've never really thought about it, but technically, that you do have a point that if someone watched Class, enjoyed it just on its own terms, and obviously it says from the worlds of Doctor Who, they might think, well, I'll check out this parent show, and then might enjoy it there. So you're absolutely right that in any way, shape or form, people can join onto the show and just enjoy it. Me personally, I had a very weird starting point. So I started on The Girl Who Waited, and my first few episodes were The Girl Who Waited, The God Complex, Closing Time, and The Wedding of River Song, which is
I'm sorry to interrupt, but that is such a that is a strange starting point.
I know.
Like, no disrespect, but that is a very strange starting point. Like, did you know that you were getting in at such a strange point, or did you just run with it and pick up the rest of it later?
Well, the latter, I guess. I didn't know that it was like only a few episodes left of the series, and I do remember being very confused in The Wedding of River Song. I somehow enjoyed it, but I remember because I was quite young, I was only about 7 years old, when I saw the next film trailer for The Wedding of River Song, the main thing I picked up on were the pterodactyls in the next time trailer, so that just gave me the impression, this episode's about dinosaurs. I was slightly disappointed when the pterodactyls are literally only in, like, a brief scene in the start when it showcases that all of time has been happening at once. But yeah, I did enjoy it despite not knowing what the hell was going on. It is very weird because people consistently say that this was the time when the casual viewer stopped getting into Doctor Who, and people were starting to, like, when people review Series 6, they'll continuously say, you can't jump on at this point because you'll just not know what the hell was going on, which is always quite funny to me, because bizarre as it happened, that's when I started, and I guess that kind of contributes to my feeling with, I guess, particularly Series 11 and Series 10, because they're both kind of very similar in this respect, and it's an opinion that I don't really see many people band around, but I kind of feel that kind of having very basic, quote-unquote, introductory stories to try and ease the viewer in, I almost kind of see that as not necessarily a bad decision, but obviously I wouldn't advise anyone to try and get in the back end of Series 6, but I just feel that if you're trying to get someone into your show, you want to try and give them, like, the best Doctor Who you could give them, rather than try and give them a specifically watered down version, because it's not really, like, showcasing the best of your abilities, I guess, because obviously with Series 11, particularly the early episodes, like, they're quite, at least in my opinion, quite bland in terms of concepts, but that's purposely because they were trying to get new viewers in. But I kind of feel that if you're like a new viewer and you watched Arachnids in the UK, you wouldn't probably think, wow, this Doctor is amazing. You'd probably think, I've seen that concept before and I've seen it done better. Whereas I guess for me, one of the strengths of Series 5 is that it eases the viewer in, but it also throws some very interesting concepts at you at the same time, which you can kind of understand, I suppose. And it's not just a problem with Series 11. I think Series 10 has a similar thing with the first few episodes, where it specifically tries to give you kind of very basic stories. And obviously I don't know because I'm not a casual viewer, but I suppose that if anyone was just by chance catching that, it might not necessarily entice them to watch it just because it's not particularly interesting, I suppose. But I'm just kind of rambling here, but I guess...
Oh, well, I think it's like, because you are, of course, like the living proof that you can get into a series like midway through. Like, well, even at the end, like, because I kind of personally consider The Girl Who Waited and The God Complex to be the end of Amy and Rory's companion arc.
Yeah, exactly. They should have left after the end of that.
I think it kind of depends on the context of how the series is currently being received as to whether or not you should try and make things a bit easier and a bit more laid back. But Series 5 and 6 were very successful seasons of the show. Like, viewing figures wise, they were well received as well by audiences. So I think that they could make long running arcs, and they could have this pretty lengthy relationship between the Doctor, Amy, and Rory, which pays off towards the end of Series 6, and in my opinion pays off pretty well. Yeah, but then when you get, say, like the beginning of Series 9 with The Magician's Apprentice, which is familiar, that series is like aggressively inaccessible. Yeah. Like if you decided, I've heard Peter Capaldi's good, I'm going to watch this series, I cannot comprehend being a first-time viewer and watching The Magician's Apprentice. It's kind of so aggressively in your face and so like very full on alienating to viewers that I think when you get to Series 10 and 11, you kind of do have to strip it down a bit.
Yeah, I would agree. The Magician's Apprentice, which is familiar, is quite weird because I almost feel like Moffat was trying to capture what he got with The Impossible Astronaut, Day of the Moon. But I think why that works as an opener is because, yes, it's quite complicated, but it's throwing new concepts and new villains at you, whereas The Magician's Apprentice, which is familiar, does a similar thing, but with old concepts and old villains, so it doesn't really work quite as well.
Yeah, I also think Impossible Astronaut it's interesting in that it's setting up a mystery, but it's also constantly moving forward, and you're learning more and you're asking more questions. Whereas Magician's Apprentice is like, okay, we're half an hour in, we've not even started yet.
It is very weird, isn't it?
Yeah, I've gone in depth on the story before, so I won't repeat myself too much here. But yeah, it's like half an hour, and we've been thrown so many concepts which have almost immediately come and gone, and we don't quite know where the story's going next, and I don't care to know.
Yeah, it is essentially like Moffat had a story that he felt was too much for one part, but not enough for two, and he just drags it out. Which is odd because I don't remember minding it too much on a first watch that nothing really happens in the first part. But I think it's weird when you watch it out of the context of it being a series opener. When you're watching it, just nothing happens, and it's more filler than like the typical classic like 7 or 8 parters, which just have so much filler. But in this, it's even more aggressive filler than that.
Yeah, and it's also like obviously there's going to be a load of in-jokes, and there's going to be some things that you as a fan or a long-time viewer will understand and get that a first-time viewer won't. But I remember watching Magician's Apprentice. I'd stayed over at a friend's house, me and my fiancée. We stayed over at a friend's house, and we decided to watch it together on broadcast, and I felt embarrassed. I was watching it. This is the show that I really like and enjoyed, and it was my suggestion to watch it. And everyone who didn't watch the show was watching this on screen, and I felt embarrassed.
Yeah, it's quite weird as well because obviously it's filler, but it always feels like two very different stories because you've got the whole plane stopping and Missy and Unit, which really goes nowhere. Like there's no reason for that to be in the story at all. It's just there. It's very strange. Like they almost felt like they kind of had to start it on present day Earth because that's where most finales do. But yeah, it just doesn't really go anywhere. That story. I actually did this on the first podcast where I introduce the guest and just start going off on tangents about things, which is all good, but obviously I did the same thing with Max where I was like, hello, this is Max, and then before I could ask him like who's your favourite Doctor, we were already rambling off about like other stuff, but obviously that was great. But just to get back onto some of the things I've got on my piece of paper here, so how did you get into
Doctor so let's Who? Get some order.
So how did you get into Doctor Who?
So when I was young growing up, I was born in the early 90s. So I was so the show was off the air. I didn't know anything about it. I do remember maybe being about 4 or 5 years old, being at my grandmother's house, and the Sontaran experiment was on, and the Sontaran really scared me, and I ran out of the room. But I had no idea what the show was. And it was in 2005 when the show came back. I saw the posters for it, had no idea what it was. Saw the big billboards and everything with Christopher Eccleston and Billy Piper in front of the TARDIS doors, and I didn't watch it when it came out. It wasn't until a week later, when The End of the World was broadcast, that my parents said, "Oh, we've got these recorded. Did you want to watch them?" So I was kind of like, I didn't want to. I was kind of forced to sit down and watch it. So we watched Rose, and then we watched The End of the World. And by the time Mickey Smith got eaten by the wheelie bin, I was completely hooked. And as soon as The End of the World finished broadcast, I saw a little thing in the credits saying, tune over to BBC Three right now to see the making of the show. So I did that, and I was amazed at all the behind-the-scenes stuff, everything that went into the making of this show. I'd never seen anything like it on TV before, and I just immediately was a fan from then on, and also just a fan of the making of and the history of the show. Because Doctor Who Confidential, they're not in the cut downs that you get on DVD, but they would interview classic doctors and play classic clips and things like that. So that was kind of how I discovered the bigger universe surrounding the show. And that Christmas, my parents got me the box set for Series 1, the one that like immediately breaks if you try and open it, and the big, like, it's like a brown gold book, the Doctor Who: The Legend Continues, which had like several pages dedicated to every single story, and like biographies of all the creatures and the species and everything behind it. And that kind of opened me up to like knowing more about this universe, and that's how I got started.
Yeah, that's a very cool story. I felt like obviously naturally a lot of people got into it 2005 onwards, obviously because it was like where it was essentially the perfect time to jump on because it was tailored for a brand new audience. And it's obviously quite weird to me. Obviously, the point I got in when I did. So I hear people such as yourself and people like Batman March and Billy Garrett John reminisce about those days where you had like Doctor Who on like billboards and things, which I've never really witnessed, or at least not from my memory. I may have seen something like vaguely similar to that, but it's just such a I guess it's particularly now where it almost seems like the BBC are trying to bury the show, particularly with Series 12 and its very bizarre marketing scheme, that obviously Doctor Who was just front and centre on the BBC. It's obviously such a nice thought now for us fans, obviously considering the strategy the BBC use now to market the show and stuff.
Yeah, like full disclosure, because I work in the media industry, yeah. I'm not going to claim to be the most well connected or have all the inside scoops and stuff, but I do understand. It's my understanding that there are some weird conversations happening between the actual production team and the marketing team. Yeah. I won't really elaborate on stuff like that, but yeah, basically the feeling seems quite amicable that the BBC could be handling the show significantly better than it is, even if it's just getting like more like making better trailers as opposed to just here's 5 seconds of out of context clips at the end of the episode. Like I was there 10 years ago on YouTube when one of the most popular things you could do was make classic series next time trailers in the modern series format, and people would love watching those, love making those, but we don't get any sort of concrete effective marketing to the mainstream now. And we got it for Series 11. There were trailers at the cinema. There was all over buses and bus stops and billboards and things like that. It was everywhere. But then for Series 12, I knew people who watched it on New Year's Day, who watched Spyfall, and then a week later I asked them what they thought of Orphan 55. And they were confused. They thought it was just a New Year's Day special. They had no idea the series had come back properly.
Yeah. It is quite weird, especially as you said, because of there being a significant marketing push for Series 11 that I remember wasn't there for Series 10. And obviously there was just generally going to be an increase in viewing figures because of intrigue, because of the female Doctor. And obviously that's why, well, partly down to the reason of why the Series 11 viewing figures were so high compared to the Series 10 viewing figures. And I think you're always going to get a drop-off going to Series 12 just because of the gap in between and stuff like that. But you can definitely see a correlation between the marketing, because I think it was like partway through November and there still wasn't a trailer for like Series 12, despite the fact it was airing on January the 1st. And that's just, you're almost setting yourself up to fail in terms of viewing figures there. And obviously it just doesn't really make much sense to me, because the BBC are putting a lot of money into Doctor Who. Why they wouldn't try and get the most out of it and, make the most, just get the most out of this show that you've spent money on. It really makes no sense to me why you would market it poorly when you could market it well. Because like, what are you losing by marketing it well? If anything, you're losing more by marketing it less. It just doesn't really make much sense why you try and bury well, not necessarily bury, I'm obviously exaggerating here, but
yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah,
kind of like not marketing it much when you're the ones who have spent the money making this. So it doesn't really make much sense to me, especially by how much they kind of marketed Series 11. It feels quite weird how they'd immediately go back to how they marketed Series 10, if not worse, for this time around. It kind of feels very strange. I suppose I'm not really sure what was going on inside the BBC there. Obviously, I don't have quite as many connections in the media industry to you. Well, none essentially.
But I think, like, playing devil's advocate for the BBC here, I'm thinking they knew that they needed to sell the idea of a female Doctor and let people know that the regime was changing. It was a different tone. It's a different feel. And I think it's why the first trailer for Series 11 was generally really well received. And it had some incredible images and a great soundtrack and feel and energy to it. And I think the marketing push paid off. Series 11, whether you like it or not, started off incredibly strongly for viewing figures wise.
Yeah, it did.
And I think my assumption is that the BBC thought, okay, so people know it's back. They know what's happened in the regime change, and there's a new Doctor and cast and everything. So for Series 12, we'll just make it. We'll make it. We'll build it, and they will come. But I think maybe because I'm not going to claim to be a super hater or a super defender of Series 11. I think it's fine. It's got some really decent episodes and some great moments and some pretty mediocre and weak moments and weak episodes. But I think because of that sort of ho-hum, maybe it's good, maybe it's not, reception to Series 11, it wasn't on the forefront of people's minds when Series 12 was being made. I think maybe if it was marketed more, people would have been more invested in it. But I think Series 12 kind of showed that if people do watch it and enjoy it, it's not a priority for them to watch unless they're told it's coming back, unless they're told to watch it. Because the social media accounts are only preaching to the choir. They are appealing to people who already follow those social media accounts. They need to reach a general, broader audience than that.
Yeah, exactly. It was kind of similar for what I had with Series 11, where when the World Cup aired, they released that very strange teaser, and then the actual trailer they released at Comic-Con, which obviously, if you're a Doctor Who, that trailer is only really going to go to people, well, admittedly, it will go to, fans of probably similar things to Doctor Who that which would come into it, but obviously appealing to, obviously it's the BBC it's being aired on, so it's obviously a public domain channel, so you're trying to get just regular people to watch it. So it seems a bit of a weird marketing strategy to almost preach to the choir, and obviously especially for Series 12, where the only real marketing I could see was on the official Doctor Who Twitter and the official Doctor Who YouTube channel, which if you're not a Doctor Who fan, you're not going to be seeing that at all. So it was a very weird thing to do, I suppose. And yeah, I think another reason why perhaps it didn't draw the viewing figures, and obviously I don't think this is any fault of the production team, because obviously things couldn't be helped on their end, but the kind of gap between, they kind of had, regardless of the quality of Series 11, viewing figures wise, they had kind of momentum, and then they kind of just stopped it for over a year. Yeah. So then when they were coming back, they kind of didn't really have that same audience that they had while Series 11 was going. And as I said, if it genuinely took that long to make, then obviously that can't be helped, that it took so long to come out. But obviously I think, obviously you think of the Rusty Davies era and how consistently those series were coming out at the same time every single year.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, I guess kind of Series 6 onwards, it's kind of been jumping around of what time does Doctor Who air, at night, what time of year does Doctor Who air, what day does Doctor Who air on. It's kind of been jumping a lot recently, so no one really knows when it's on, where I guess with the Rusty Davies era, it was kind of people knew that was when Doctor Who was on in the spring, and then a Christmas special. It was rinse and repeat every few years, so it kind of gained that kind of comfortable space in the TV schedule for most people. Whereas obviously now, no one knows when Doctor Who's going to be on. Even Series 13, obviously because of lockdown, we have no idea really when it's going to be released. Obviously they said late 2021, I think, but that was before lockdown, so I don't really know when it's going to appear. But I think certainly that less familiarity in terms of when Doctor Who is broadcast is kind of contributed to its decline in viewing figures over the years. And I was quite interested because I saw a graph about a few months ago where people say that it kind of went down after Tennant left, but it was actually very consistent up until Series 8, and then Series 9 was the first series to witness a real drop-off in viewing figures, which I thought was quite interesting because, yes, it was a decline, but it was only by like 0.1 or 0.2 million viewers, whereas then from series 8 to 9, I believe, it's like 1 point something million viewers drop off, and then it kind of continued and then went up with series 11, but then is back down to the series 10 kind of average with series 12, which is a shame, because obviously I don't think the show will be cancelled, just because the BBC really has nothing like it. As we said at the start, there's no other show like Doctor Who, and it's the only real marketable show the BBC has in terms of all the merchandise they sell. Like, they're not going to be able to do like Line of Duty spin-off audios or Line of Duty lunchboxes or whatever. So Doctor Who's their like uber marketable show. So I think it'll be a number of years, and I think it'll have to take until it gets really bad that it's literally would be a waste of money for the BBC that they'd really consider cancelling it. Because while the viewing figures aren't amazing at the moment, I still feel that Doctor Who has enough uniqueness to it that the BBC wouldn't even consider cancelling it in its current state.
It's interesting when you think about you were saying that the show is it's unlike anything else, but in a way, because it has been on the air for 15 years since it came back, maybe it is natural that you'll see a decline, because after 15 years you're either on board with the show or you're not.
Absolutely.
And no regime change is going to change that. But conversely, this is going to sound like I'm making excuses and I'm just a massive shill, but hear me out. Because the viewing figures were down for Series 12. No disputing that they were down. They were disappointing for what Doctor Who has done before. Still good generally for TV. I'll do some more comparisons in a moment, but they were down for the show. However, because we do live in a streaming world where the show is always available on BBC iPlayer, you can watch it on Netflix, you can watch it through all these different other formats. Those figures are just, with time, only ever going to go up. Like, we're not going to compare them to previous numbers. We're not going to compare them to how the show started out, because we don't have those numbers. But over time, it will just continue chugging along, because you can now live in a world where you ignore Series 12, and then a year later, it's on the iPlayer and you can just binge all of it. And that person then maybe becomes a fan of the show and watches Series 13. That's just the type of world we live in, where it is now so flexible and easy to consume or watch content at your own pace. I never watched Game of Thrones when it was being broadcast, but now I'm watching it on DVD. I do not contribute to the viewing figures of Game of Thrones, but I'm still watching it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we do need to take that into consideration, that just a lot of people don't watch broadcast TV that much compared to, the heights of the David Tennant era. Because I was thinking, Doctor Who is generally the only TV show that I watch live. So, generally, a lot of people will just, most popular shows are just on streaming services, or if people are watching a show from the BBC, they'll watch it on catch-up, or they will buy the DVD or watch it on iPlayer. They won't just sit down on a Sunday night and watch it live, because there's just not that level of commitment from people. If you can watch it when it's convenient to you, why would you watch it at a certain time when it maybe isn't convenient to you? It doesn't, in a sense, it doesn't really make much sense. It only really makes sense to us fans, because obviously we feel a dedication to sit down and watch it at that time specifically, and watch it from beginning to end when it airs. But obviously most people, even if they were interested in Doctor Who, they're not necessarily watching it live. And obviously it does take BBC iPlayer into consideration, I believe, for the viewing figures. But even if someone was to just watch it on Netflix, or if they only stumble across it on there or whatever, it isn't contributing to the viewing figures. And obviously a lot of people say that Doctor Who is dead, Doctor Who's going to be cancelled, but it's a lot of different factors, as we've discussed, in terms of why the viewing figures are down. And as you said, a TV show that's been going on for 15 years would receive a decline in viewing figures naturally. Most shows wouldn't even last 10 years, let alone 15 years on
Yeah.
television at this point. So, we should be thankful that we've got even that with Doctor Who at the moment. Because, I think that, and I was talking to my parents about this, that in a sense, Doctor Who is kind of an outdated format for a show. As much as I love it, most shows are kind of that high-budget Netflix continuous story across multiple episodes, and Doctor Who, that whole different setting each week, not an amazing amount of continuous elements running through. Yes, you get old villains and obviously the same cast and even maybe an arc, but it's not to the extent of most modern TV shows. And the fact that if Doctor Who wasn't made in 1963 and was conceived nowadays and broadcast, would it be a success? Probably not. So Doctor Who's success now is kind of only really owed to its conception back in 1963, because that maybe one of the reasons why there is nothing like it on TV at the moment is because it is kind of outdated. As much as it pains me to say it, that as much as I think Doctor Who's format is its greatest strength, it's also, in a sense, its greatest weakness just compared to anything else on TV at the moment, because while you could argue people should watch Doctor Who because there's nothing on TV like it at the moment, you could also say there's a reason why people aren't watching Doctor Who at the moment, because there's nothing on TV like it, because it's not like the shows they like to watch. And I think there's so many things like Black Mirror, I guess, and kind of anthology shows, which are fairly scarce nowadays, that are really comparable to Doctor Who. And even then, like Black Mirror is a completely different cast of characters and settings each week, whereas Doctor Who, there is nothing like Doctor Who on TV, and that's a good thing, but I suppose that's also a bad thing at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's a weakness if you only view it as the success of a show from its viewing figures, because I think it's because you do have a different story or setting every single week. So, like, maybe you've got a friend who really, really likes Base Under Siege historical drama. Okay, so you get them to watch Cold War, but they're not going to tune in for the next episode. They're going to maybe just watch that singular episode, maybe. So you don't maybe get a consistent pattern of viewing. You don't get consistent viewing figures. But I think the Timeless Children viewing figures were the 7-day figures were the lowest of the revived series. So we've got 4.5-ish million people who watched it in the UK. Now, I understand it's a different show, but I think it's safe to say one of the biggest success stories of UK TV this summer is the TV show I May Destroy You, if you've heard of it.
I haven't heard of it, actually, but...
Okay, so it's a comedy drama. It's kind of like the brainchild of Michaela Cole, who's a really great up-and-coming rising star talent. It was made for BBC One and HBO. It's a 12-part drama comedy series, and it is the unquestionable success story of British TV this summer. It was viewed by 200,000 people on the BBC. 200,000 people compared to the lowest Doctor Who story at 4.5 million. I'm looking at the BARB viewing figures. It doesn't even... It doesn't chart. Its viewing figures were so low, it doesn't even chart on the BARB. Now, it's got a different format because you can watch it on the iPlayer and then it also gets broadcast on the TV, but the BARB does account for that. You can't see it anywhere, but it's still considered a massive success. Doctor Who, even on its weakest day, is doing better than 90% of all other TV in the country. So when you look at what the show is doing now, it's disappointing by Doctor Who standards, but generally for TV, it is still one of the biggest success stories in this country.
Yeah, absolutely, you do have a very good point, because as Doctor Who fans, we're naturally just comparing it back to itself and kind of worrying, well, this is a big drop, so it must be near cancellation, and all getting very, very worried about that. But obviously, when you compare it to other TV shows, it's actually doing very well. So, yeah, as I said, obviously all these factors contributing that, the viewing figures are lower than they were before. It's far off cancellation, I would say, and I wouldn't say that the BBC would put so much money in to particularly the Chibnall era, like Instantly from the Woman Who Fell to Earth, the like visual style and just the amount of money that the BBC are putting into it. I'm not sure of the exact budget compared to like the Capaldi era, for instance, but it does feel like they're putting a lot more effort into funding the show, just visually.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't make much sense to me why the BBC would clearly take more of an interest in it since the Chibnall era, but would then be, would be worried about viewing figures and would like instantly cancel it. Like, it would make no sense. So the BBC clearly have confidence in the show at the moment, probably a lot more confidence than your general fan, because us fans, we're just naturally going to be worried about anything, because Doctor Who is in such a big part of our lives that if it just goes off the air, we're kind of sat there thinking, well, what am I going to do with my life now? But obviously we should have more confidence that Doctor Who is going to be alright, but I think it's natural for just fans of anything to be worried that it's going to leave us at some point. I'm always talking about like it's some sort of relative that is dying and leaving me, but I guess to fans that's almost what Doctor Who is, that almost extra family member that has been there with you throughout most of your life, and that kind of comforting thing. That it's natural to be quite worried that it might be off the air for a little bit, because as much as a lot of fans say Doctor Who needs to be cancelled, I know a lot of those fans don't really want it to be cancelled, because how much fun would like a 15-20 year hiatus be? Not much fun if you're a Doctor Who fan. So, as much as some people might not necessarily enjoy the current era now, I mean, I'll hold my hands up, I'm not the biggest fan of the current era now, but I think it's very brave words to say I would genuinely like it to be cancelled, because ultimately, whether you like Doctor Who or you don't like Doctor Who, like the current era, it's just nice to just have it on the air. And as much as I may have been slightly disappointed with certain stories in Series 12, I'm always going to be tuning in, because even if I'm not the biggest fan of certain stories, I always have that, I at least try to keep that optimism where maybe it will be better next time, or because despite the fact I found Series 12 disappointing in some areas, there were still stories like Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror and Spyfall, which I really enjoyed, especially Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror completely caught me off guard. I just really enjoyed that, and I'd say it's the best outright historical story since Vincent and the Doctor, in my opinion. I just really enjoyed that story quite a lot. So even though you get some stories like The Timeless Children, for instance, which I wasn't a big fan of, you still have those odd episodes in there that I really enjoy. So why would I stop watching the show and say, right, I'm not a fan of the current era, I'm out, when there are still parts of this era I enjoy, because there are parts of every single era of Doctor Who that I enjoy. So a lot of people who stop watching Doctor Who, fair enough, but for me, I just couldn't do that, because I just enjoy it too much to say that the negatives outweigh the positives, because while there were certainly negatives to Series 12, there were also a lot of positives for Series 12. So I just think, as much as some parts I didn't enjoy, I obviously enjoyed some parts because I just enjoy Doctor Who, and to me at least, I think that the positives outweigh the negatives. And that is why I will most likely never stop watching Doctor Who, despite how much I may feel that perhaps it's not as good as it used to be, because there's always those glimmers of hope within any Doctor Who series. I don't think there's ever been a truly flat-out terrible series with no good episodes. There's always those bright sparks, and even the darkest series of Doctor Who. I'm not a big Series 8 fan, but you still have episodes like Mummy on the Orient Express and Flatline, which are genuinely really good stories. So you always get those bright sparks in Doctor Who, which I guess is always good. I don't think we'll ever see Doctor Who truly die and be terrible, like consistently terrible. because obviously I think just the general format of Doctor Who with different writers will just stop it from ever reaching that level of just creative, like devoid of any creativity, because it's just so varied that you're bound to get bright sparks in anything that is Doctor Who.
Yeah, you've made me really want to rewatch Flatline now. I need to rewatch that story.
I haven't watched it in a while, actually.
But I remember really, really enjoying it. I need to revisit it. But like when people immediately go to like cancel the show, get rid of it, stop it because I don't like what it's doing, I do question why they're taking such an a quote unquote extreme stance on it. Why would you not want to maybe see it improve or be constructive so that people can have the same experience that you did when you were enjoying it?
Absolutely.
Because if it wasn't for Doctor Who and Doctor Who Confidential, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now. In terms of my general career and work in media and TV and film production. And I wouldn't want to say cancel the show, get rid of it, because I don't want Doctor Who to not influence the next person who could also be doing that. And it's like, okay, so your plant pots have broken inside the house. Demolish the whole house. Get rid of all of it because I said so. I think that there's way more constructive ways to approach it. If you don't like it, then stop watching. Come back when you think the show is more for you, and that'll be absolutely fine. But to say tear it down, stop. I don't think it's controversial to say that. Like, there are some people who really do like Series 11 and Series 12, who get a lot out of it, who really like the direction it's going in, and they get great joy from watching it. Like, if just because you're not enjoying it, do you want to deprive those people of that? And that's kind of where I kind of question whether or not people who are sincerely calling for the show to be cancelled are actually acting in good faith.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously you bring up a good point that while I personally may have not felt that Series 11 was amazing, there are people who really enjoyed that series, and more power to them, because I get more out of Series 6 and 7 than most people do, so it makes sense for people to get a lot out of Series 11, and I've seen these people on Twitter, and I just think more power to you. I'm glad that you're enjoying this, because I certainly know that there are things that a lot of people dislike in Doctor Who that I just enjoy a heck of a lot more than other people, and every single aspect of Doctor Who, someone is a fan of it out there, like you said, like with Class and all these different things. Like, if you hate something, there's like people are guaranteed to love it. Just look at Hellbent. Most people really dislike it, but then there are some people who just absolutely love it. So, you know, Doctor Who, every single aspect of Doctor Who, and just every single aspect of everything, you know, there's always people who dislike it and people who like it, and I don't think we should deprive those people who like something just because we may not like it. I know you are quite a bit, well, I say a big fan of Series 11. You like it more than a lot of people, and you actually enjoy it more than Series 12, which I found pretty interesting.
Yeah. I don't think I'm on an extreme end either way for Series 11. I'm kind of quite moderate in my opinion. I did a ranking video and I ranked Series 11 basically in the middle. I think it had some really strong aspects to it, and because I thought the reason I like Series 11 kind of sounds like the reasons you were a bit lukewarm to it, because it was standalone stories. It was a bit more back to basics. Part of what I really liked about Series 11 was the completely different tone and feel. Like, I don't think I'll ever forget watching the opening of the Ghost Monument and thinking, this is what Doctor Who could be. Like, obviously the Ghost Monument is not a narratively ambitious story. The characters aren't particularly complex or interesting, but just the opening 10 minutes, I've never seen Doctor Who look or feel like that, and that was so exciting for me.
Yeah, it did look incredible. I had kind of a similar feeling when watching The Woman Who Fell to Earth. Like, just those first few minutes, just thinking, this just feels so different to what had come before. And like, it was kind of a nice feeling as well to just think, I never thought Doctor Who would be like this. yet here it is. And I almost feel that kind of uniqueness you got from the first few episodes of Series 11, it's kind of not really followed suit, because I guess, at least for me, with Rusty Davies and Stephen Moffat, you can kind of sum up their visions for Doctor Who. But I guess with Chibnall, I can't really feel that. I kind of feel like his is just kind of a blend between the two. But I guess...
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah, with the Woman Who Fell to Earth especially, I do feel like there is a very unique vision for the show that I guess hasn't really continued throughout. And I'd still say that The Woman Who Fell to Earth is one of the best episodes of the current era, I suppose. I think Series 12 brought, at least in my opinion, probably the best episodes of Jodie Whittaker's tenure, just in the form of Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror and Spyfall. I'd probably say are the two best stories of Jodie Whittaker's tenure so far, but I still stand by the fact that I think The Woman Who Fell to Earth is the strongest episode of Series 11. And I just feel it's that kind of uniqueness to it, and that kind of freshness to the TARDIS team and to Jodie Whittaker, and that whole feel and vibe you get from the story, that I just remember sitting there and just feeling, wow, that I was completely on board for this new era for the show. And that's, at least in my opinion, it's kind of faded out, and by the time we get to Series 12 you are seeing a much more Moffat-y vibe for the series, which is very odd seeing as it's written by Chibnall, who I don't really see him and Moffat as even very similar in terms of writing and their writing styles, but it almost felt like Chibnall was almost trying to imitate a Moffat arc, and you almost feel like that's why the Timeless Child arc, at least for me, regardless of its actual reveal, I don't think quite worked in terms of how it was threaded throughout the series, because you get some episodes which are really arc heavy and others which would just have nothing to do with the arc. And I feel like rather than thread an arc across the series, which I think Moffat, particularly early Moffat, was quite well at doing, I think Series 5 in particular, I think you look at how well the Crack in Time is threaded throughout that series. I feel that Chibnall really should have looked at that in terms of how to thread his arc across. Whereas I feel like he almost took more inspiration from something like the later Moffat stories, like Series 8 or 9, where you get stories which are very arc heavy, and then you get stories that really contribute nothing to the arc at all, which I don't want like Series 6, where you have certain stories like the arc plays a part in every single story. I don't mean it like that in terms of this series is really arc heavy, but more in the case that you kind of get the arc is a constant throughout the series. It's not in your face, but it's just kind of there. But I think that why the Crack works so well is with the Rusty Davies arc, it was more of, this is a thing. You will find out what this thing is by the end of the series. Whereas with Series 5, at the beginning, it's here's the Crack. And rather than saying you'll find out what this crack is at the end of the series, you kind of slowly find out more about it over the course of the series. So in Time of Angels, Flesh and Stone, you find out that it erases people from time, and that it was the cause of an explosion. Then in The Hungry of Cold Blood, you find out that cause of the explosion was the TARDIS. And then by the time you get to the Pandorica Opens Big Bang, it's less of finding out what the crack is and more of watching a story about the crack unfold, I suppose, which I personally think is the best way to handle a story arc in terms of getting the best of both worlds, getting the best out of the Rusty Davies arcs, and also getting the best out of the later Moffat strategies, which were a lot more heavy-handed than Series 5, where he kind of got a bit carried away with himself, I suppose, later on.
Yeah.
I realise I haven't actually asked you this, despite the fact I joked about it earlier. Who is your favourite Doctor, Mr. TARDIS?
My favourite classic is, I am in the minority here, absolutely, Peter Davison, Fifth Doctor.
Yeah, that's quite...
Because I think, like, so many, like, classic era Doctors are so like the Doctor just turns up and leaves, and that is the story. The story that they're in is the story that they're telling, and that's absolutely fine and great and lovely. But I think for Davison, he was kind of the first Doctor where they were actually kind of seeding constant development over the course of his 3 seasons, where he starts off like in the shadow of this massive, bombastic, confident Doctor who had been there for 7 years. Tom Baker was the institution. And then this young, fresh-faced, blonde, dashing character comes along, and in his first season, he fails at almost everything he tries to do, and the first season ends with one of the companions dying, and that kind of hangs with him through the rest of his tenure. And then the last season he's in is just nothing but misery and death and despair. And he's trying so hard to be kind and optimistic and trying to be the dashing Doctor who really wants to help out the world and save everyone. And he ends up trading his life for that ideal in the Caves of Androzani. And I absolutely adore that arc. I love it so much. I think in terms of actual stories or performances, maybe other Doctors have done better, but there's just something about that commitment to theme that really resonated with me.
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting, because I know that, well, what I've been doing over lockdown is kind of marathoning my way through the classic series, not necessarily in chronological order, but kind of like a couple of stories from one Doctor and then move on and then rinse and repeat, because I watched a fair bit of the classic series, but nowhere near like a lot of it. So I was kind of thought during lockdown I'll watch all of the classic series. I'm still going, but I think before that I kind of had this thing where Davison was one of my least favourite Doctors. I kind of felt that he was very bland and very beige, and not just because of the costume, but just generally in his personality. But I think as I've watched a lot more of his stories, I do appreciate, particularly his later stories, how like that arc they were going for in terms of that vulnerability and how he just wants to put things right but he can't, and how he's not the most authoritative Doctor and not as authoritative as some of the other Doctors, but they kind of use that to their advantage. And I kind of feel they should do a similar thing with Jodie Whittaker, where yeah, maybe she doesn't have quite the authoritative side as previous Doctors do, but rather than have that as a weakness of her Doctor, maybe use that as a strength like they did with Davison later on, and really play on that aspect of the character. So I almost feel like Jodie Whittaker is quite similar with Pete Davison, whereas for me in Pete Davison's first series, his characterization is a bit weird in terms of some stories he's very tetchy, and then others he's more of the Fifth Doctor we get to know later on. Like I think to Doomsday, he's very oddly characterized in that compared to other stories. And I think certainly in season 20 and 21 they had a greater fix on where they wanted to go with Davison. Like I was watching Snake Dance the other day, which is my favourite Peter Davison story, and I feel like how he's characterised in that is just brilliantly, and it really suits his Doctor. And I feel like in season 20 and 21, they really kind of found that, especially in 21, when you have things like the case of Androzani, which is entirely built around the idea that this Doctor is good-willed, but he doesn't quite have the authority of some of the other Doctors, and they really play on that. When how do you have this Doctor where he isn't quite as confident as the other Doctors, but equally as good-willed, and just throw him into the most terrible of situations and see how he would react to that. And I think that's certainly great, but I almost feel like with Jodie, it took them at least a series to kind of get a feel of where they were really going with this Doctor. But I feel like in series 12, because one of my big complaints with series 11, I think it's why it left me so cold with Jodie's Doctor, is because she was very one note. I think why I like the Doctor so much, particularly as I've gotten older, because obviously when I was younger it was, oh, he's very quirky and I like this. But as I got older, it was really that the complexity of the Doctor. Like I think one of the reasons why even like Matt Smith was my first Doctor, so I'm always going to have an attachment to him. But while I think he's remained my favourite Doctor as I've got older, it's just the complex nature of him in terms of he's very quirky, but there's always that sadness in his eyes, and how he can go from being very light-hearted to instantly turn to very serious, which I feel was something that we almost didn't really get with Jodie in Series 11. She was almost written to me as someone writing her like David Tennant and Matt Smith without really knowing what makes Tennant and Smith work so well, that they just thought people like these Doctors because they're young and quirky, and didn't really think about why those Doctors work so well, at least for me, which is the complexities of those Doctor, which, yeah, on the surface they feel like kind of dashing young men who are quite quirky, but then below the surface there's something darker there. And I was very grateful that they certainly played with that in Series 12, which is why I really connected with Jodie a lot more in this series. And it's kind of, I'm very optimistic for her in Series 13, because if they keep on building upon that, then I think we'll get a really good 13th Doctor in Series 13. But I almost feel it's a bit, unfortunately, a bit like a Davison situation, and it's almost quite similar to Capaldi, where in their last series, or I don't know if Series 13 is going to be Jodie's last series, but in their later series, they really nailed down what makes that Doctor work. But unfortunately, it took them a little while to kind of get there, I suppose, which is a bit disappointing, especially with Capaldi, because I think he's so perfect in Series 10, but unfortunately, he's halfway out the door by that point, whereas if they characterised him like that throughout his whole era, I would have preferred him a lot more, I think.
Yeah, I think Davison's 3-season arc I could be completely overthinking it, and maybe it was completely unintentional. But when you compare it to like Capaldi, I think his third and final season is the one he should have started with.
Yeah, absolutely.
But with Whittaker, like I love and appreciate the idea of a Doctor who doesn't know what to do in a situation, who doesn't always have the right answers, who doesn't know, who sometimes will get the morality wrong. And I think that's absolutely fine, and there's merit and there's credit to that idea. But I think because these stories that she's in aren't actually pinning down those ideas, it comes across more like a bug as opposed to a feature. Like at the end of It Takes You Away, where she kind of shrugs off Graham, or at the end of Arachnids in the UK, where she tries to have a weird and humane solution to the spiders, and things like that. I like that. Like in a vacuum, in a bubble, those things do not come across well. Yeah. And I think if you actually explored those ideas and said, actually, this is intentional, this is what we're exploring, it could really work. But because she's in these massively overcrowded stories where she has 3 other companions to compete with, you don't explore them.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the issue. In my opinion, the best stories of almost every prospective Doctor is the ones where they are in a situation which they are entirely unsuited for. Like David Tennant in Midnight, where his arrogant, big, larger-than-life personality and sometimes outright condescension backfires on him, and he almost dies because of it. And you've got The Caves of Androzani for Peter Davison, and like Heaven Sent for Capaldi, and etc.
Yeah.
I don't know what situation you could put the 13th Doctor in where she would be challenged, because I don't know what her foibles are that are intentional or not.
Exactly. I think you raised an interesting point about what is intentional or what is not, because I think, like with Arachnids in the UK, an idea of the Doctor saying this is more humane and it actually being wrong could be interesting, but it's not portrayed in a way that feels like this is intentional, but more in the way of we genuinely think that this is humane, because none of the companions speak up about it. So the episode is essentially really hammering home that letting all these spiders suffocate to death is more humane than just shooting them, whereas that should be much more of a complex debate. Whereas the episode paints it one-sided, which gives me the impression that it was just kind of not very good writing, rather than being having a intentionally flawed Doctor. It kind of reminds me of Batman versus Superman, where Batman kills, and I think that would be quite an interesting thing to do if it was kind of like a self-aware thing where it's wrong that he's killing, but because the film paints it in, it does really bring attention to the fact that him killing people is a negative thing. It strikes me more as kind of lazy and bad writing more than in having an intentionally flawed character. I think that's almost similar with the 13th Doctor, particularly in Series 11. I think in Series 12 they kind of got a better feel with her Doctor, but even still, I think she is quite inconsistent between episodes. In some episodes she feels like the bubbly Series 11 Doctor, and then in some episodes she feels like a completely different character. I think it's quite jarring going from the ending of Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror to the beginning of Fustive of Legiduna, and she just feels like a completely different character. It's like, yeah, where did this come from? Her whole very somber attitude of, I've got to find the Doctor. No, sorry, I've got to find the Master. I'm really slipping up, but got to find the Master, and where do you go?
I've got to find my reflection somewhere.
Yeah, where do you go when you're not alone? And this whole "you don't know me" stuff, which just does not come across in the 2 episodes preceding it, and it's very strange. I think that. Yeah, I think inconsistent characterization can be the downfall of a Doctor. It was really my biggest downfall with Capaldi, is how I didn't connect with him, is he just is 3 completely different characters. And it's really hard for me to, like, for example, if I'm ranking the Doctors, what do I rank Capaldi on? Do I rank his Series 10 work, which I really like, but then I need to take into consideration his kind of very inconsistent work in his previous 2 series, and it's like, how do you really view that Doctor as a whole when they're kind of very different to like their respective moments in different series? It's like, what do you take into consideration? And I really hope that they are starting an arc in Series 12 that they kind of follow through in Series 13, and I hope it wasn't more of, this is something we're only doing for this series, and then in the next series it's going to be back to kind of a very generic bubbly Doctor, and kind of lose all these kind of flaws and imperfections that we explored in this series. And I hope her characterization wasn't just to service the story Chibnall was trying to tell, and was more of, this is the direction we want to go in genuinely with this Doctor, I suppose.
Yeah, I think one thing that helped Capaldi and helped David Tennant as well was that they did have multiple companions.
Yeah.
So there were different dynamics for them to play with, especially Tennant, who got a different companion every season. It's why I think he had some of the most, like, in terms of his variety, in terms of how he was portrayed and how he responded to situations. Whereas Whittaker is in a crowded TARDIS, and I don't know what she would do without her companions, or what the companions would do without her. I don't know I only kind of associate her with this unit, if that makes sense. I don't associate her as a Doctor on her own, which is why I'm kind of hoping that in season 13 that we either get a new companion or we significantly trim down this fam. But when it comes to her portrayal, it's a bit more disappointing, because here's me bringing agendas into it. I think it's really interesting to have a female protagonist in a genre TV show who is portrayed as insecure but technically minded, pragmatic but sometimes unable to make the correct decisions. Because, like, in terms of sci-fi media, you, broadly speaking, for leads, you either have the badass gun-toting Sarah Connor or Ripley, or you have the more for lack of a better term, maybe Mary Sue. I know that's a terrible term, but just for this example, you very rarely have anything in between that. This genre is so lacking in flawed or technically minded female protagonists. So then when one does arrive in the 13th Doctor, but she's constantly competing for space, or is in these stories which aren't suited to her purpose, it's a bit more disappointing in that front.
Yeah, absolutely. I think having companions for too long, especially companions that kind of hinder your Doctor, can literally hinder your Doctor. It's my main problem with Capaldi, with the fact that I think he really works with Bill, but he has Clara for 2 out of his 3 series, and personally I am not a big fan of the 12th Doctor Clara relationship, particularly in Series 8. I think it gets better in 9, but I think it's almost like if you had Rose for 2 out of Tennant's 3 series. I think we look at the Tennant era quite differently, but whereas he only had Rose for 1 series, so because I think it was quite interesting, because I've also been marathoning the Revive series with my family in chronological order, and I never really realised how weak not just Series 2 is, but Tennant to me. I don't really feel as if he gets going as the Doctor until he loses Rose, like almost immediately in The Runaway Bride. He feels like he has a lot more confidence.
Agree.
But it's almost like if Tennant had Rose for 2 series and he only got going in the 3rd series, I think we look at Tennant's era a lot differently. But because he lost Rose relatively quickly, he was then allowed to go on and just be the best Doctor he could be. And I feel that really hindered Capaldi, and it feels like it almost hinders Jodie, but it's kind of almost weird because unlike Tennant and Rose and Capaldi and Clara, where I think their relationship is actively kind of annoying, I wouldn't even say that about Whittaker and her companions. It's almost just non-existent, rather than the Clara and 12th Doctor relationship actively annoys me and how kind of toxic it is. But with this, it's almost very hard to have an opinion on it, because it's just very non-existent. Like I was thinking, like I can't really think of any iconic 13th Doctor and Ryan moments. Like what kind of relationship do they really have? Like it's not really been explored at all. And when you look at, like, these companions have been around for longer than Martha did, or for longer than Donna was around, yet you still have such a better understanding of them as characters than you do with these companions. And I think it was just such a mistake, not only having 3 companions, not only introducing them all at the same time as well as introducing your new Doctor, but making them all from the same planet and time period, because then you're all just going to have very similar characters and they're all going to be quite boring. Whereas if you either had 1 or 2 of them from present day Earth and then the other one they maybe picked up later on their travels, I think it'll be a lot more interesting, and they just have much more interesting personalities. Whereas I almost see Ryan and Yaz especially as just kind of like generic kind of placeholder companions. Like if you ask someone, write a kind of generic female companion, they probably write Yaz. Like they literally write Yaz.
I think they'd write Series 11 Yaz, definitely.
Yeah, Series 11 Yaz. I would agree that Yaz improves in Series 12 with her recklessness, but Series 11 Yaz, and especially, it's just kind of like, yeah, if you were to write generic companion, here's Yaz. If you were to write generic male companion, kind of write Ryan, and generic older companion who's comic relief, you write Graham. It's almost weird because Chris Chibnall is so renowned for his character work that his character work here is almost, it's just ridiculously paper thin, and especially as we've known them for 2 series, I don't really feel like I know these characters at all. Like Graham, I only really like him because of what Bradley Walsh brings to that performance. On paper, he's just as weakly written as Yaz or Graham. And it is such a shame, because I think there is certainly potential with these actors to really make great characters, but unfortunately it's kind of a similar thing I have with Whittaker. It's just the writing and the direction with the characters, particularly Series 11 Whittaker I'm talking about here, is that it's kind of disappointing when you get these very capable actors, but the direction for them just is kind of non-existent. And I feel that that's what we're going to look back on the Jodie Whittaker era, which is really disappointing, because I'd say a similar thing about the Capaldi era. It's kind of disappointing that we've got these 2 eras in a row that I really feel we'll look back on and think, what a missed opportunity that was. Like, look at these great elements here that we just will never utilize to their full effect. And I think that's just, it's obviously quite disappointing, because you can see the potential there, but then they just don't really go with it. And I certainly think Series 12 was an improvement, but even again, like we're having Ryan and Graham potentially, like, very likely leave, and I still don't feel like I know much about Ryan. Like, the personality traits he has are more in terms of servicing the story they happen to appear in, and less of general traits that are kind of present in him as a person across all these stories, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the idea in Series 11 in concept that this isn't the Doctor and companion. This is a four-person team, and I think that's good. It's a different, unique dynamic. But then, because you were saying how you think Chibble maybe turned Series 12 into something more Moffat-esque, but Moffat's approach to structuring a series is diametrically opposed to having a big TARDIS crew.
Yeah,
because I think Moffat is very singular in what he wants to do with the companions. He wanted, like, Amy spent like a season on her own with the Doctor, and then it was all about the couple dynamic in Series 6, and then you've got everything to do with Clara for two and a half series, etc. And I think if Series 11 had ended with resolution and Graham and Ryan decide, okay, we know what, I've met my dad, we've made amends, we're going to stay in Sheffield and try and rebuild this relationship. I think that would have been so perfect. And then in Series 12, it's the 13th Doctor and Yaz. Maybe towards the end, he introduced a Captain Jack type character, like you do in Series 1. I think, like, because you're 4 or 5 episodes away from Series 1 ending, you throw in another companion. You throw in Captain Jack. And I think that really helps. But what you were saying about how you can look back and be disappointed at all of these elements, this shouldn't excuse the showrunner at the time. But we are fortunate in a way to be in a world where Doctor Who is able to course correct because of the expanded universe and Big Finish.
Yeah.
Where Big Finish can make amends for the 6th Doctor's era, where they could hypothetically make several more stories with the 12th Doctor, Nardole, and Bill. Where maybe down the line we could have stories where it's Jodie Whittaker on her own, and maybe she drops off her friends at Sheffield and then has like 400 adventures with another companion, because that's what Peter Davison's done.
Yeah.
Where they drop off Tegan accidentally at the end of Time Flight, and according to Big Finish, him and Nyssa had like 100 adventures between them and the next season.
Yeah, the possibilities are endless, I guess, for that, and like Big Finish are immensely good for course correcting and really finding great relationships with doctors and companions that I guess weren't present on the show. Like, I think the relationships between, well, the 5th Doctor and Nyssa, as you mentioned, is so strong on Big Finish that it almost makes you wonder, why didn't they do more with that on the TV show? And I think that whereas on the TV show I wouldn't have really thought of a strong relationship between the 5th Doctor and a companion. I guess the default is Tegan, just because she was there for practically his whole era. But I think that when you really find a companion that really... I think that's where certain Doctors click and certain Doctors don't, is their relationships with the companions are really pivotal. Like, I think that the 11th Doctor and Amy and Rory as well, I think, as a three, they just work so well together, whereas when you have the 12th Doctor and Clara, because that relationship doesn't quite work so well, it does kind of hamper a lot of those stories. I think the same thing with the 6th Doctor and Perry, particularly in season 22, where because their relationship isn't quite working, it weakens those stories, whereas if you had him with a companion that would really click, I think you'd find a lot more enjoyment in a lot of those kind of infamous season 22 stories, because I think a lot of people underestimate how important the relationship between a Doctor and companion is, because it can really make or break a series. For me, as I've said, one of the main reasons I dislike Series 8 is purely because of that 12th Doctor and Clara relationship. And I think that whereas a lot of people think you have a Doctor, you have a companion, there you go. I think it's a lot more deeper than that. And I think, even as fans, we kind of underestimate, like with the 4th Doctor and Sarah Jane, who have just incredible chemistry. I think we almost kind of underestimate just how important it is to have that incredible chemistry and just how much it adds to those stories. Because if the Fourth Doctor had a different companion where they didn't quite have the best of relationships, we probably wouldn't look back on the Philip Hinchcliffe era in quite the same way as we do, because it's the Fourth Doctor and Sarah Jane and their incredible relationship.
Yeah, it's completely different in the classic series in a way, though, because I'm watching quite a lot of Troughton at the moment, and he starts that era with 3 companions, which is it is a crowded TARDIS, and Ben and Polly, in my opinion, are not remotely interesting, but because his stories are substantially longer, like you've got like 6 and 7, 8-part stories, you can afford to have a larger TARDIS team, and you also are able to split up the companions as well. Which can help, can really help with the structure sometimes. Because I've been working on an audio drama of the 13th Doctor, and about a third of the way through, I split up the team because that TARDIS team is too big to work with for a full story. Well, I'm sure it can work in some situations, but for me, it was like priority: split them up.
Yeah, I almost feel like, because a lot of people, when people complain about 3 companions, people say, well, Doctor Who started with 3 companions back in 1963, and that worked. But I've been watching a lot of Hartnell, and I think what makes those stories work is, A, they are substantially longer, so you have so much more time to get these companions to do a lot of things, but also the First Doctor has a different relationship with each individual companion. And
there's more conflict as well.
Yeah. With his relationship with Barbara is completely different to his relationship with Ian, and his relationship with Ian is polar to his relationship with Susan. Whereas with the current era, I don't really think there's much to split the 13th Doctor's relationship with Graham to her relationship with Ryan. I think her relationship with Yaz is slightly different because it's kind of improved in terms of direction a lot more over the course of Series 12, but I still don't think you have those unique relationships that I think you need with all these different characters. Like, even though Pete Davidson's era is infamously the crowded TARDIS, I think the fact that all those companions are different really helps it, because you have then a unique relationship with each individual companion. That the Doctor's relationship with Adric is just completely different to his relationship with Tegan, and vice versa. Whereas I don't think you really get that in the current era, and I think it is purely down to the fact that the companions are just way too similar to each other to make them interesting. And it's like you said with Ben and Polly, because they're from what at the time was present-day Earth, and we'd already had a fair number of present-day Earth companions at that point with the likes of Dodo and obviously Ian and Barbara. It struggles to make Ben and Polly interesting, because you just feel like you've seen these characters before. Like, what really is there to separate Polly from Dodo, for example? Like, there isn't much really. But then when you bring on Jamie, he is a completely different character, and that's why it works so well, because he has just a completely different relationship with the Second Doctor to what he has with Polly, and then later on when you get Victoria and especially Zoe, like that final Troughton TARDIS team is just completely different to like each companion is completely different to each other, and that's why it works so well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I think bringing up Jamie as well, when Jamie comes into the TARDIS team with Ben and Polly, he makes Ben more interesting. Yeah. Because now Ben has got, like, he wants to be the alpha male, but he's this guy from the 1960s going up against a Scottish Highlander, and there's a lot of machismo there that they're trying to compete with each other, and it makes Ben more interesting.
Absolutely.
But because of this, because Ryan and Graham and Yaz, I'm sure that there's probably some things that they do disagree on, but the stories don't capitalize on it. They do just get along really well. It is a flat team structure, which is fine. But then when you draw it out, like I said, if it was just that team in Series 11, great idea, great, a great experiment to do for a year, really mix up the formula a bit. But when you spread that out to Series 12, especially when Ryan and Graham's arcs have basically ended by the end of series 11. We don't know what they're doing there, and I think it will be. It's why partly I want Whittaker to stay on for a long time to really annoy certain people, and you know who I'm on about.
Yeah,
but I also want her to stay on for a while so that her character can be fleshed out more, that she can meet more companions, she can be in more settings and stories to really capitalize on. Because Whittaker is a great performer.
Yeah,
I think she like, if you've seen her in Broadchurch, Attack the Block, and many other things, she's great. I think it's called Adult Life Skills. It's a really great indie British comedy. It was one of the last things she was cast in before she was cast as the 13th Doctor. Yeah, Adult Life Skills, a 2016 like indie comedy. She's really, really funny and really good in that. She is great, but I don't think the stories capitalize on her.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you raised an interesting point. I think that something I was thinking about was that, we've seen Ryan disagree with the 13th Doctor in that moment in The Haunting of Idiodati, but what if that spiraled out and then Yaz was like, Ryan, I don't agree with you, you're just being selfish there, and then you had more conflict between the companions, because it almost feels like if one companion feels a certain way, they all feel a certain way. So if Ryan doesn't like what the 13th Doctor is doing, then generally the others will either agree or just won't really say anything. Rather than having that internal kind of friction, which is something that, while I don't think it was amazingly present, I think you got with Amy and Rory, because while this is probably a bad example because it really has no relevance in the story whatsoever, and is almost a wasted concept in itself in this story. But in A Town Called Mercy, when the 11th Doctor pulls the gun out on Jex, and Amy's like, what are you doing? And Rory just allows him to do that, and Amy's kind of like, what the hell are you doing? And while that kind of friction isn't capitalised upon in that episode, I just felt that's like a really interesting concept, which I don't feel that we've ever really seen too much of, especially in the Revive series. The companions always kind of just agree with each other, and while the companions have friction with the Doctor, I think companions having friction with other companions would actually be quite interesting.
Yeah, going back to the original first Doctor, Ian Barber and Susan dynamic, it's that conflict is laid bare almost immediately in the story. And in the Daleks, which is their first off-world journey, and the Doctor, spoilers for a 60-year-old story, but the Doctor lies.
That's fine.
Spoiler warning. The Doctor lies and says, "Oh, we must explore this city because they might have something the TARDIS needs." The TARDIS is broken down, and then they get there, and it's like, "Okay, I lied. It's fine." But they actually, the Daleks end up stealing the component, and it's a big source of conflict where the first Doctor and even Barbara is like, the Thals must help us. They must sacrifice themselves to help us get off this planet. And Ian is there saying, What is wrong with you? This is your mistake. You lied. It's your fault we're in this, and you're going to ask these people to risk their lives to make up for your mistake."
Exactly. There's that's that like great line where Ian says, like, "What do you want them to hold up for their victory? A fluid link?" Like, it is a great scene. You are correct. That kind of friction is just great.
And a modern version of that, because it's a story that is literally a third of the length, so it can't quite do it, which is fine. But it's like Thin Ice, where Bill sees a kid die, fall in the frozen lake, and she needs a moment to just process everything, and she just cannot understand the 12th Doctor's casual nature about it. And that sort of it is reminiscent of the 7th Doctor in Ace. Not in that situation, it's not manipulative, but it's that whole cold, calculating, inhumane approach to this journey that they're now on. Yeah. And it's when things get real. And I really want to know what that is. What would cause Ryan, Graham, and Yaz? I want to know what is their line. What would stop them from traveling? Because I was on a panel a few weeks ago when we were talking about who should leave in Revolution of the Daleks, sorry. And we were saying, and some people were saying, "Oh, I think that Ryan should die." Like, not saying they hate Ryan, but it's more like kill off a companion, raise the stakes. It's a dramatic way to get rid of someone. However, if you did that, Graham is traveling with the Doctor because he needs the coping mechanism, the distraction, because of the death of Grace. You kill Ryan, Graham will double down on that. You don't get rid of Graham then.
Yeah.
So if you you've written yourself in a corner where you can't kill off a companion without having this knock-on effect with another one. How do you disrupt this team? And it's why in season, if this is going to be another a four-person TARDIS team for another season, I want a companion centric story. I want a Dr. Light story. She's stuck on the other side of a mirror or something, and these three companions can actually talk and figure out what they are without the Doctor.
Yeah, I think it's one of the great reasons why The Girl Who Waited works so well is because you have like the friction between all three characters, but in particular, what that story works so well is Rory, who is kind of the secondary companion, with Amy being the primary companion. You focused a lot on the relationship between Amy and the Doctor, but what happens if you take Amy away from that and you're just stuck with Rory and the Doctor, and what happens there? And it's just such a great analysis of not just that TARDIS team, but just what the potential of having a TARDIS team. And it's just such a brilliant story. But I feel that obviously you've praised that story before on your channel a number of times, and I 100% agree. I think it's fantastic for what it does with the characters and how you see the 11th Doctor in a darker light because of Rory and things such as this. And I almost feel like what would have been a great idea for them to explore with Bill, which I don't think they do, is that Bill is a human and she's travelling around with two aliens, the Doctor and Nardole. So what if something happened and they both responded in an alien way, and she's like, no, you're acting really alien, but she almost feels quite alone because you've got she's with two people and they see things in a completely different way, and maybe she almost feels a bit put off and almost alienated by that point because like she's just there alone, the only human there, and these two people she doesn't really know. And I almost feel like that would be such a good kind of thing to play around with. I think it's almost just like with whatever companions you decide to add into the show, you need to kind of think about like what interesting dynamic are you going to get out of this. And I think it almost like, people from 21st Century Earth is good for a while, but I think especially I think it starts to get set in when you introduce Clara. And as much as I kind of enjoy the relationship between the 11th Doctor and Clara in Series 7B, I do acknowledge that yes, it is a very stale and samey relationship, and that's kind of the point I think in the Revive series, where it started to turn from these 21st century companions are great to this is really starting to get stale now. And I do think it was such a missed opportunity not going with the Victorian Clara, because that's just, even if it's just a slight difference, like yes, they're from Earth, but they're from a different time period, and it's interesting how such a small difference such as that can completely change the cogs in a relationship. I feel we just really need something like that to freshen up the show, even if it was just to have Captain Jack back, because he's an alien character. How different does that change? Like, we could almost do that kind of thing that I mentioned of having someone who's travelling with two aliens be alienated if the rumours are true and Yaz does end up travelling with 13 and Captain Jack joins in. How would Yaz feel if she's travelling? She's had the comfort of having two people who she can see eye to eye with around her. How does she feel if those two people are gone and now she's surrounded by two aliens? How would she feel about that? And I just feel when you're writing a companion, as I said, I think your kind of ground zero on conjuring up this character should be, how do they interact with the Doctor, and is that interesting? And if that's not interesting, then let's change up that character a bit to make it interesting.
Yeah, because in some ways, what makes the companions so interesting isn't necessarily just whether or not they morally agree, or just the fact that one of them's centuries-old time traveler, and the other one is human. It's also just, it's little things. It's like how you've got this street punk ace in the Seventh Doctor's era with this completely it's a mismatched pairing. The two couldn't be further apart, but they get on so well with each other because of those differences.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, they balance each other out really well.
Yeah, I completely agree.
And there's also Bill and the 12th Doctor did conflict sometimes, but one of my favourite moments of that run is in the Doctor Falls. I think it's the last thing they ever say to each other, where Bill says to the Doctor, says, "Hey, you know how I'm usually all about women and people my own age? Yeah, I'm glad you knew that." And I think it's I know some people cringe at that, but you get the context that Bill is not out of the closet to her foster mother. But she is in the TARDIS. Yeah. She's very open. She's able to be herself, and I think that's that whole paternal relationship, the way that she is with the Doctor, but not with her own family, with the family that she lives with. I think that's really telling. Yeah. But because the only family we kind of see in the 12th Doctor's era is Yaz's family, very sporadically.
Yeah.
It's one thing I really like about the Rusty Davies era. It not only brought it into the 21st century, where Rose is declared a missing person because she's been gone a year, and then the Doctor actually has to face up to that, and he gets slapped by the mothers all the time. That brought the show into the 21st century, but now we've kind of regressed from that again, where Clara's relationship with her parents is a key aspect of her character in Series 7. It's never brought up again after that.
No, it's very weird that I almost find that so strange that it is such a key point of, particularly early on, you get that those initial scenes in the Rings of Akated where it's so pivotal to Clara's character, and you just don't hear about it again. And then by the time you've got to the Time of the Doctor, which, while I do really like the Time of the Doctor, I think one of the weakest aspects, as well as the Tasha Lem stuff, is her family dynamic, because that's a completely different family. They even recast them for some reason, and it's just a stock family. And you what are Clara's relationships with her dad and her stepmother, I think it is? What's her relationship with that? We don't know. We never see them again, and I almost think it's very similar with Yaz, that while it is better because we have seen them a few more times, it's what's really Yaz's relationship with her mother? I still don't really know. And what's her relationship with her father? And I think what works so well about Rusty Davies is those, yes, he did repeat the family aspect through all three of his main companions, but it never got stale because people have different interactions with their family, and each three of his companions had completely different reactions with their family to each other. I think what's so genius is that Rose, towards the end, and Rose's family were quite close-knit with the Doctor and were actually actively helping him out on his adventures. And then you go to Martha, where her family literally sells her out to the Master. And kind of different interactions there, which I think works so well. I think Russell was a genius at that, and I think it's always a testament to Russell that he essentially did the same thing over and over again. Yeah, it never felt stale. Because he just added things to it. He kept things fresh, which I don't think we've really seen after the Rusty Davies era. While I really like Amy and Rory, I think that almost Rusty Davies set the groundwork with the intention that his successors would build on that groundwork, but I don't really think they have. I think they've just kind of just accepted the groundwork and just kind of stayed there. Whereas I think that Russell at least probably would have hoped, with him just having consistent 21st century Earth companions, well, other than Captain Jack, obviously, but I think that he would have probably hoped that by now we would have started seeing a change, and unfortunately we haven't really. And yeah, I think that's almost one of the reasons why this current era has left so many people cold, because it's very hard to get into an era where you just don't really feel anything, and that's kind of why Series 11 left me so cold. And I kind of went off Doctor Who for a little bit. I wasn't really bothered about watching Series 12, and then while I have mixed feelings on Series 12, something I am certainly thankful for is it really just, as soon as I watched Spyfall Part 1, it just immediately piqued my interest back up with Doctor Who. But I think why Series 11 left me so cold is that I just didn't really know where I stood with this Doctor. Like, I just didn't really feel anything with Jodie Whittaker's Doctor because she did feel so generic and so devoid of personality. Obviously, in Series 12, she has much more of a personality, and that's why I enjoy her a lot more. But then again, you've got the companions, and I kind of dread doing a companion ranking video because I just wouldn't know where to put Yaz, Graham, and Ryan. Like, I just couldn't physically compare them to these other companions because even Clara, who I didn't like, at least I knew that I didn't like her. Whereas with, like, Yaz, I just don't really feel anything. Like, how do you put... Yeah. It almost feels like, because when I'm watching other people's companion ranking videos, I almost feel like, how do you rank that character? Because that's kind of like ranking a character who's only appeared in a few stories compared to a companion who's appeared in loads of stories. And then I need to kind of familiarise myself and think, actually, no, these companions have been in story, have been in series, have had a longer run than a lot of other companions, so why does it feel that we barely know them? And while we certainly do have hints at a characterisation, I think there is one of the weaker points of 13's era, and I am looking forward to it just being the 13th Doctor and Yaz, or if we get another mechanism in that machine of just like freeing up the relationship so we can really concentrate on a good Doctor-companion relationship rather than just trying to account for all these different relationships and kind of quality over quantity, like a good strong relationship rather than lots of relationships but very thin relationships.
Yeah, so when you were to, if you rank the companions, do you rank Yaz, Graham and Ryan as like one entity? Because it seems like that's kind of how they were designed.
Yeah, I think I'd have to.
In a weird way.
Yeah, I'd have to because I really couldn't. Like, I really would not know where to put Ryan and Yaz especially. I just wouldn't know where to put them. So I think you would really have to rank them as a whole unit because, like you said, that's kind of what they're being focused on. And for better or for worse, that's kind of what they feel like. If they've got an emotion, they all feel it and that kind of thing. There's the show hasn't really concentrated on really trying to differentiate these characters from each other, so I would find it really hard for me to try and differentiate them because, yeah, they just feel like one entity. Even the like specific jobs they fulfill, especially in Series 12, like Yaz is the reckless one who has a slightly more intimate relationship with the Doctor than the others. Graham is very much the comic relief, and they kind of fulfill specific roles, but I don't feel that they really feel like genuine characters in their own right.
Yeah, I agree with that, and because the stories that they're in as well are like so full, and like there's just there's no time for them to stand out really. Like especially when Orphan 55 is there, and it's just them running underground from creatures, and there's like a massive cast of characters, and they've got nothing to do. Yeah, it's a shame because it just comes across like a load of like dead weight, and that's exactly not what you should be thinking about for your central cast.
Yeah, obviously you put a tweet out quite just before we recorded really about how you feel that were the biggest problems with 13's era is just how jam packed it is, and nothing really feels like it has time to breathe. And I absolutely agree with that. I'd say that one of its biggest flaws, and I agree with Orphan 55, like I was really excited as a big In-Betweeners fan to get James Buckley in an episode, and he's barely in it. It's like, you could have taken that character out and it would change nothing about the story. And it's similar, it's almost like the Saranga conundrum of that series, because that's the same, where you have just so many characters and none of them really need to be there at all. And it always seems like mad to me, like why would you even attempt to do that? Like, why would you just have so many characters when you yourself cannot even write 3 companions well? Would you then try and add a load of guest stars on top of that? Like in a classic story, you could do that because companions would split off, and you'd usually change locations a fair bit, especially if it was a longer part story. But you don't have the time yes, the stories are kind of 50 minutes rather than 45, but we have less episodes a series, which means that the production team are going to be actively put off doing more two-part stories, because if you had like 2 or 3 two-part stories, that's like over half of your series there. So we're not going to get those stories that are going to flesh out those characters as much, which I guess is a shame, especially when we have these companions who really need it.
Yeah, and it's also a shame because I am what you could call a Chris Chibnall apologist.
Yeah.
I think he can be a very good writer. I've been following his work since he was doing plays in the early 2000s. I think he can do really well. And we were talking about how earlier on how some of the Doctor's best stories are ones where they are like their ideals are like their weaknesses are brought to the forefront, or where they're really confronted with something. And his first ever story for the revived series was 42. It's a story which kind of turns the 10th Doctor on himself, and I think that's a really strong story. So he knows fundamentally what he's doing. And I think if you write down the plot and the themes and the ideas that he's going with for series 11 and 12, you'd maybe read that document. I don't know if they had a series Bible, they probably did, but if that were to be published and you just read that, you'd think this was one of the best series of Doctor Who ever. But then in execution, it's jam-packed. There's too much happening. There's the companions in. I know you like Spyfall, so I apologise for throwing shade on a story that you love. Get rid of the companions in part 2. They have nothing to do.
I would agree on that. They don't really do anything. It's just kind of like when you want to see this really interesting Master Doctor dynamic, you just keep on cutting to this side story that you're not really interested in. And I think it kind of supports our point about companions from different time zones, when I feel so much more invested in Ada Lovelace and Noor Inayat Khan in that story than I do with the actual companions we have. And that's kind of a problem when these side characters, which are just in like one half of a 2-part story, kind of feel like more well-rounded characters than your companions you've had for nearly 2. And obviously we have had them for 2 now. And And I think it's interesting because you brought up Chris Chibnall's previous work, and obviously 42, a story which really challenges the Doctor. Hungry Earth, Cold Blood is similar in some aspects to The Girl Who Waited, where you split Amy off and you have just the Doctor and Rory, and especially The Power of Three, which is all about that Amy, Rory and Doctor dynamic. And that kind of feels so weird to me that even like not just his other work, even in Doctor Who, he kind of specialises in those interesting character dynamics that, it almost feels like it's a completely different writer who's writing this era. Like, Chris Chibnall, he almost feels like 2 different people to when he was... it just feels so weird that if you said, Chris Chibnall, he's going to be running Doctor Who, what do you think his vision is going to be based on his previous work? And if you kind of sum that up, like I know a lot of people probably did in speculation videos before Series 11 come out, that would kind of be completely different to what we have now, which I think is very, it's very peculiar, because obviously with Moffat, if you looked at his stories beforehand, before he became showrunner, you looked at Series 5, you kind of say, I can see where he's got there. But with Chibnall, you look at like The Power of Three, and a very interesting character dynamics, B, a really good solid concept at the core of it with like the cubes and things. And then you look at Series 11 in particular, where very weak character work and a lot of the concepts for the stories, particularly early on, which were the main stories which were written by Chibnall, kind of concepts that you kind of feel like you've seen before. They don't really correlate, and that's something that I never really picked up on before Chibnall became showrunner. I was kind of saw Chibnall as kind of the writer, like a very meh writer. Like, I don't hate any of his previous works, but I don't love them either, in terms of his Doctor Who work. But now when you look at his Doctor Who work, his previous Doctor Who work, with like a magnifying glass, you can really see that his strengths from those stories really haven't come across into his Doctor Who work. And it's even, I'm going through Life on Mars at the moment, which I've never seen before, and his episodes of those in particular really focus on the dynamics between the characters. And yeah, it just feels so odd to me that he does feel like almost like an Auton duplicate of Chris Chibnall has now found his way as showrunner, and the real Chris Chibnall is tied up somewhere. It does just feel so weird because it's just not his style at all. And obviously a lot of people like to say, well, it feels so weird that clip in the 80s, he's essentially criticising his own work, but that he's almost completely changed his view on Doctor Who from when he was younger to now. But almost like he's changed his view of Doctor Who from like just a few years ago to now. It's very strange, but I guess all we can do is just hope for the best and hope that Chris Chibnall kind of finds his way a bit, because I feel that he is finding his way, maybe not in terms of the plot, because I don't really want to go into it here, but I wasn't a big fan of what he decided to do in The Timeless Children, but certainly with the Doctor, he seems to, I mean, even instances with Yaz with her recklessness, he seems more focused on what he wants to do with these characters, and I guess we can only hope that that vision that he has kind of progresses and flourishes into more of its own thing in Series 13, where certainly by what we know, he'll have more time to breathe and develop that.
Yeah, well, when you look back on Chibnall's pre-showrunner stories, when you watch his like Series 11 and Series 12 stories and you watch those, in my opinion, you can tell it's the same writer.
Yeah.
You can tell. But this, like, let's say you've got dinosaurs on a spaceship, which has a pretty big cast. You've got the Doctor, Amy, Rory, Brian Williams, Rory's dad. You've got temporary companions. You've got Queen Nefertiti and John Riddle. You've got a pretty big cast of characters, all things considered. However, the premise is really simple. Big cast, simple premise. It balances out. But then you've got something like Orphan 55, which I know wasn't written by Chibnall, but I think it's a good comparison, where you've got a really big cast, a massive cast, but also a structurally pretty complex story where they're moving back and forth to loads of places. For some reason, they're all together, whereas in Dinosaurs on a Spaceship, they split up. And you have a twist. You have a twist at the end. It's building to different numerous things. You've got a big cast and a big premise. And it kind of bulks under that weight. And when you've got Chibnall focusing on one thing specifically, or maybe a handful of things, I think he really shines. I think the villains in his era are consistently terrific. I love Gat. I love his portrayal of the Daleks. I love his portrayal of the Master. I love Ashad before he was just thrown away in the Timeless Children. That's great. And when you've got like Resolution, where it's about the Dalek, and it's about Ryan's relationship with his estranged dad. Great stuff. It's one of his best recent scripts. But when he goes way more complex in Spyfall or Fugitive of the Judoon, which was co-written by Vinay Patel, that's where he stumbles.
Yeah, I would agree with you on Fugitive of the Judoon, and it's actually, me and Max spoke about this in the previous podcast, where it is a very messy story, and I do kind of find it odd that people say, like, that's the best episode of Whittaker's era, where to me I don't even know if I can call it a story, just as much kind of just Chris Chibnall had a lot of setup and he didn't know what to do with it, so he just put it all in this one story. And I think it has even less weight now because a lot of the stuff he set up either goes nowhere or wasn't really needed for the ideas he had to work in the first place. Like, you don't need Captain Jack or even anyone there to set up the Lone Sideman dilemma for the Lone Sideman dilemma to work. You don't need as much as I like her, you don't need Ruth's Doctor even there for the revelation of pre-Hartnell Doctors to come across, because it's not even really made clear in the episode if she is a pre-Hartnell Doctor. I know that that's what's genuinely implied, but it doesn't concretely say it, so and it's not like Ruth's Doctor was really hinting at the fact that she was a pre-Hartnell Doctor, so it almost feels like very weird setup, that kind of unnecessary setup in that sense. And I remember watching your review, and Fugitive of the Judoon really left me cold in just how much it almost felt like to me of kind of like a two-parter, but in one story. Like, there's that scene where it's revealed, like, the 13th Doctor finds that there's another TARDIS, and the Ruth Doctor turns around and she's in the full outfit and she's like, "Hello, I'm the Doctor." It almost feels like you should be getting like the title sequence music, and that's the cliffhanger for a two-parter. It almost feels like the second
Yeah.
part is kind of just condensed into 15 minutes, and it doesn't really go anywhere. And I think if that was a two-parter, you could have more Jadoon stuff, which I feel they were kind of underused in that story, and then more time to not only flesh out the kind of Ruth Time Lord dynamic. You kind of have a bit of a story where the Doctor are kind of on the run from the Time Lords, and Ruth kind of explains things, but also the companions could go off and do something with Jack, and maybe they could go off to like a alternate future where everything's destroyed, and they're like, you need to stop this lone Cyberman because look, this is what happens. And then that would give even more weight to Ryan saying, Doctor, no, you don't give it what it wants because I've seen the future and everyone dies, kind of, rather than them just presuming it.
Yeah, because I love Haunting of Villa Diodati. I think that's the best story of Series 12. But like, you've got Ryan, Yaz, and Graham, who have they've met Captain Jack once.
Yeah.
And so they've had like 2 minutes interaction with him. And yeah, if I was in a room with John Barrowman for 2 minutes, I'd be compelled to do whatever the hell he said as well. But like they are strongly trying to argue this position about you shouldn't give the lone Cyberman what it wants. But it's only off the back of the advice of a complete stranger.
Yeah.
So in that way, it kind of feels a bit weak. Fugitive of the Jadoon really should have been a two-parter. Absolutely. I want the big, like, multi-part, big finish correctional story in 10 years' time, or the Target novelization, which massively expands on it.
Yeah. And obviously, I don't mean to take away from anyone who likes that story, because I know we're particularly in the minority, but I do find it very, obviously people like it, and that's absolutely fine, but I do really struggle to see what people really see in Fugitive of the Jadoon, bar the surprises. Like, yeah, Jack's back, and yeah, we've got a new Doctor who's quite cool, but other than that, I just don't really see what's the appeal of it. Like, yeah, we've got a cool new Doctor, but she doesn't really do much. It's kind of less of a showcase, to me at least, of how awesome Ruth is as the Doctor, and more of this is how she bounces off 13, because it is kind of like a 15-minute multi-Doctor story, less of a 15-minute showcase of Ruth, and that's why I think she desperately needs to come back, because she was sorely underused. But yeah, I don't really see what people really see in that story, because it is just setup, and at least for me, I don't particularly think any of the setup was either necessary, or even what it was setting up, it either didn't contribute much to it, or the ideas it was contributing to, I wasn't the biggest fan of. So at least for me, that's why I'm not a big fan of it in hindsight, but I wasn't even much of a fan of it at the time. But obviously we do seem to be in the minority, because most fans absolutely adore Fugitive of the Jadoon.
Yeah, it's a story that I have no inclination to revisit, because it is just... It only really, in my opinion, like, I think it recently topped a Doctor Who magazine poll as the best story of Series 12. And more power to those who love it, absolutely. But for me, it is just set up. And it's kind of scattershot set up at that. And Joe Martin, the reason people have gravitated towards the Fugitive Doctor is, in my opinion, solely because of Joe Martin. Her character's not on the page, in my opinion. Like, I've even edited like compilations of her dialogue in that story, and it is just variations of "shut up, stop talking, cease and desist, there's a good girl." That is 90% of the Fugitive Doctor's dialogue in that story. Any presence that character has is solely due to the performance, and that is one reason why I think I want to see more of Joe Martin.
Yeah, I'd agree. I almost feel like it's hard to rank Joe Martin with the other Doctors, just because she's less written as a Doctor in her own right, and more of how can we make this Doctor completely contrast to Jodie's Doctor, and that's kind of how she's written as. She's specifically written as the polar opposite of Jodie's Doctor, because they want to create an interesting multi-Doctor dynamic, and that's I kind of feel that Joe Martin elevates what's on the page, as you said, because what's on the page I don't really feel is kind of a character there, and is more of just, let's contrast her to 13 really well, and that's why in some ways I'd really like her to become the 14th Doctor, because I almost feel like, and this is probably me completely speculating here, but it almost feels weird that Chris Chibnall would give her a police box TARDIS knowing that would be contradictory. Like, why would he do that? Maybe it's because he's actually like having us on that she's a pre-Hartnell Doctor and she's actually the 14th Doctor. I'm obviously just purely speculating here, but I feel like if you gave her the actual Doctor position, you could really flesh out her Doctor and just give her material that's worthy of Jo Martin's acting ability, rather than just saying you're kind of like the anti-Jodie Doctor in that, just like she's the polar opposite to Jodie's Doctor, even in the sense that she has a lot more of a classic costume compared to Jodie, because Jodie's costume is kind of the most far removed costume we've had from classic Doctor, other than Christopher Eccleston. So yeah, it kind of feels like she was more of like, you can't really have Jo Martin's Doctor to me without having Jodie Whittaker alongside her, because she's very much tailor-made for that specific incarnation. But obviously if we see more of Jo Martin, which I hope we will, that could obviously change. But with what we've got at the moment, it's very hard to consider her like a well-rounded Doctor, but more in the sense of kind of like an accessory to Jodie's Doctor.
Yeah, and it kind of says a lot about the priorities of the creative team. If they wanted a Doctor just to solely contrast with Jodie's Doctor in that story, but also only give them scenes together, which is entirely exposition.
Yeah.
Where because they're trying to figure out this mystery together, they get brought on board the Jadoon ship and they're kind of trying to figure out what's happening. So the objectives are so opposed to each other that they want to have this contrasting relationship, but there's no room for it in that story.
Yeah.
It's why she doesn't come across as anything, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But if she was the 14th Doctor, I'd be very happy with that, because I think it would be a bit of a shame to have the first non-white actor to play the Doctor, and she is just an accessory character, she is just someone who she's just to the side, and we can kind of ignore her. We don't ignore her, but we categorize her separately, a bit like John Hurt.
Yeah.
I think it will be. I think she maybe deserves a bit better than being in a different category, like maybe like the War Doctor or David Bradley's First Doctor and things like that.
I almost feel like, though, with John Hurt's Doctor, at least he got like a whole episode to flesh out his incarnation, and he's the reason why John Hurt's hidden incarnation of the Doctor works for me is because he spans the Time War, so that's kind of like a significant event to tie to that Doctor. Whereas with Jo Martin's Doctor, she doesn't really have that. Like, she's just kind of there. There's not really much significant about her Doctor. She's just kind of like that one Doctor who's similar to other Doctors you like, but she had a lot less screen time, like literally no screen time at all. So and John, I'm actually planning a video on this in the near future. I look forward to it. John Hurt's War Doctor is so well suited to that anniversary special as well. He is.
Because people say that they really wish it was the 8th Doctor or the 9th Doctor in that story instead, and I disagree, because you need a Doctor who isn't a familiar face to people.
Yeah.
Because Stephen Moffat, the reason he changed the Time War was that he couldn't imagine the Doctor pressing that big red button. And there's the great scene in the Tower of London where the War Doctor says, like, I'm looking at you and I can't think of another word than dread.
Yeah.
Like, when they look at him, like, you don't want the 9th Doctor that you maybe grew up with, was your introduction to the show, and 10 and 11 looking at him with dread.
Yeah.
I think the contradiction from the audience and the characters would be too much there, and that's why a new Doctor with someone with the immediate gravity like John Hurt works so well in that story.
Absolutely.
Whereas Jo Martin is a great. She leaves a great impression in spite of that story, not because of it.
I almost feel like with John Hurt, like, yes, he is tailor-made to directly contrast both of Smith and Tennant. That's where a lot of the humour from Day of the Doctor comes from. But he also, while doing that, he also has quite a layered backstory and quite a complex personality for the Doctor. And he's kind of like a kind of weathered older Doctor who's just kind of done with everything. And I feel like that's almost what Jo Martin lacks. Like, yeah, she contrasts great with 13, but what else is there to her? And bar her being more of a classic Doctor, which, yeah, she may be more similar to someone like Hartnell, but Hartnell had a lot more screen time, so I'm naturally going to gravitate towards him more than I am Jo Martin, who is just kind of that Doctor, but with a lot less screen time and a lot less developed. And I feel like they really need to, even if they don't cast her as the 14th Doctor, they really need to give her just a lot more screen time to just kind of justify her existence. I had an idea for what I'd really like Revolution of the Daleks to be, which wouldn't happen because it involves the companions not being there and Captain Jack not being there, so it definitely wouldn't happen. But I think it would be really cool if, for example, the Doctor's imprisoned because the Judoons say that the Doctor was trying to start a revolution against these kind of figures in power on an alien planet, where it's revealed that the Daleks were behind them, but that's why the Doctor's in prison. But our Doctor hasn't done it. It's actually the fault of the fugitive Doctor, and the Judoon have made that same mistake again, and then the fugitive Doctor comes in, breaks her out of the prison, and then they both go on an adventure to kind of stop this Dalek uprising that the Doctor was originally imprisoned for. And I think kind of like a multi-Doctor story, but just with those two, kind of like what we got glimpses of in Fugitive of the Judoon before it was unfortunately cut short, would be really great. And I think almost what I'd like for Jodie is maybe for the series 13 is her final series, but she gets something like Tennant where he had a run of specials where it's just him, and I almost feel like even more beneficial to Jodie that she has that, because I think we've seen a pattern where her relationship with the supporting characters are just more interesting and better than her relationships with her own companions. So you give her a whole run of just where the companions are just supporting characters of the actual story. I think you'd see her Doctor really, really thrive.
Yeah, I'd like to see that as well. Like I said earlier, that I'd like Jodie to stay on for a bit longer. But either way, she needs something. Like, I don't think what that character needs to have an effective, lasting legacy is not something you can do with just one more series as it currently stands. Because one thing about the Fugitive Doctor is that I'd kind of like her to be to the Chibnall era what Captain Jack was to the Rusty Davis era and River Song was to the Moffat era, where they are just part of the regular supporting cast, where they intermittently come and visit and come back like once every season or two.
Absolutely.
So that was kind of it.
Yeah, I'd agree. I was just going to say that I feel like what you were saying with Jodie needs one more series to really, like more than one series to really leave a lasting legacy, is how I felt with Capaldi, that he needed one more series to really have a legacy as the Doctor, and unfortunately he just didn't get that. And as I said earlier, I just fear that maybe that history is going to repeat itself, and it's especially depressing because it's repeating itself so quickly, that, 2 Doctors in a row where they're kind of only really coming into their own in the last series, and it's a bit too little too late, and that's just unfortunate. We are like 2 hours and 10 minutes in, so I kind of get it's been a long chat and I've loved it. I felt we should almost be wrapping things up now, but one thing I certainly wanted to mention to you is I wanted to bring up the work you've been doing on Twitter with your Perfect Doctor Who Shorts Twitter account, which I've been loving. I kind of wanted to bring that up.
Oh, thank you.
What was the inspiration for that kind of drive to really make that account?
Because what I've done with that account is not remotely an original idea, just first and foremost, because there is the One Perfect Shots Twitter account, which I'm just looking at now, has got like over 500,000 followers, and has been they post like I'm scrolling down now. In the past hour alone, they've posted like 6 images, so they are way more productive than me. But yeah, it was more just because it kind of started with me doing my shot-by-shot videos, where I did one for Heaven Sent, and I've done one for Dalek, where I kind of want to emphasize to a fandom that can kind of puts a little bit too much stock in the idea that just write better stories. This medium, these shows are made by people, and it's why I want to make sure that I credit the people behind it accurately when I do these posts, where I'm trying to do it once a day, where it's a great shot from the classic series or the revived series, done by a director and the director of photography. It was just to kind of combat lockdown stuff, to try and just give myself something to do during the lockdown.
Yeah, I think it's been a tremendous success. It's obviously been quite a popular account, and I've really enjoyed seeing the various different shots. Obviously, not just ones you suggest yourself, but ones that other people have kind of sent in. I know I've sent a few shots in myself, and it has really made me kind of change the way I look at Doctor Who direction, because I think with Doctor Who, it inspires a lot of people to be creative and to get into the TV and film industry. Like, it's certainly something I'd like to get into in the future. Is kind of like the dream role is kind of in some way have a job in a TV or film. And I think that just looking at all these shots and really appreciating quite an underrated aspect of Doctor Who, because I think especially like when you're younger, especially, you just take no notice of it. It's just Doctor Who looks like Doctor Who, like. But obviously, when you get older, you start to notice of like the certain shots and the dedication from directors and how great it looks. And I think it certainly made me think differently about just how great certain episodes of Doctor Who looks and the impact of the directors in general. And yeah, I just think it's such a great project for highlighting the work of Doctor Who directors. And yeah, I think it's just been a great project all round and a tremendous success. It's something scrolling through Twitter I've certainly enjoyed seeing.
Yeah, thanks so much. And yeah, because there's only so many like shots that I can think of, like, in order to put on the account. I've got a folder on my desktop where I'm constantly adding to it, but it's also it's great to see the type of submissions that I got from followers. There's also just some stories where the stories that I'm not a fan of at all, but they look beautiful or they have amazing shots. Absolutely. And there's some. It's always funny to get some images or some GIFs, because sometimes the shots they're not impactful in a still frame. I think the one that I posted the other day was when David Tennant does his sigh before he goes to sacrifice himself for Wilf, after he's done his like big monologue, and he sighs and he looks basically down the barrel at the camera, and that's kind of something that you just can't really get in a single image. I think it needs to be seen in motion. But it's always fun when I post something and people respond saying, I can hear this GIF, or I can hear this image, because sometimes there's so many factors that go into making something work. And even episodes that I don't like, I try to give every story a fair shake. And I think there's probably maybe one or two shots from every single story that might be worth putting on that account.
Absolutely. I think you were talking about episodes you don't like. 2 episodes, Hellbent and The Timeless Children. 2 episodes I'm not particularly a big fan of at all. Like, I will acknowledge those 2 stories look amazing. Like, there's something about Gallifrey in the revived series that just looks so stunning when you give directors the task of shooting it. And yeah, there are certainly a lot of shots from those stories. I think the direction through Doctor Who as a whole has always been pretty good, especially revived Doctor Who with obviously the more modern techniques. But even in the classic series, there are just so many just great directorial moments. And as you said about hearing GIFs and things, I think I'm guilty of myself of just saying, yeah, they should write things better and things, particularly when I was younger and I was watching Matt Smith, and then I got into Capaldi and I really started to feel the shift of, I'm not actually enjoying this so much. Why is that? And my thing would always be, the writing's bad. And obviously, as I've got older, I've kind of pinpointed, well, why is that writing bad? Is it the characterization? Is it this, and this? But I think certainly it's very important to highlight that it's not just the writing that makes a show, it's the writing, it's the performances, it's the direction, it's the music, it's all these different aspects that really contribute to make a terrific production. And yeah, I think your account has really highlighted this and just spreading some really nice positivity about Doctor Who, which I really appreciate.
Cheers, thanks so much. And in case anyone who has submitted stuff is listening, I'm not ignoring you if you have sent something from Heaven Sent, or from Hellbent, or from a Rachel Talalay directed episode. I've been sent so many frames and gifs from those stories, and I don't want to spam Rachel Talalay's timeline. I'm parceling them out as I go. Because she's been quite supportive of the account. She always like retweets and like comments and stuff like that, and that helps like bring more people to the account. Yeah. I also don't want to be spamming her timeline.
Yeah, but in a sense, she's worthy of spam because her work is just phenomenal.
Yes.
Like the amount of shots, like all her stories are just phenomenal. Like I was watching a clip from World Enough and Time, the ending shot, and just how that's directed is just so phenomenal, and her usage of colours as well, and the like oranges that I noticed she uses in Hellbent and also in The Doctor Falls when you have those Cybermen walking through the streets. It's beautiful, and like I say, it's just really nice for people to kind of highlight the work of directors, which I suppose to people who aren't like you and me, who aren't like massive fans, kind of goes unnoticed. Like people don't really think like, oh yeah, that TV show looks great, or that was a nice shot. Like people don't really pick up on that too much, but it is certainly an important role. And yeah, as I said before, it's just nice for you to give them recognition.
Yeah, and the thing with the directors for Doctor Who as well, like I think when you really kind of like look at it a certain way, look at the shows, and you're looking for these idiosyncrasies and these visual like these little motifs that each director brings to it, you really start noticing them. Like Graham Harper, he's such an energetic director. He did Journey's End, 42. He did Rise of the Cybermen. His camera is almost always moving.
Yes.
And like Charles Palmer, give him a green screen and he'll work magic with that green screen.
Yeah.
James Strong, what did he? Because I've just got that name, and I can now
Daleks in
completely
Manhattan.
forgotten my points.
I know he directed
I look really
that
silly.
Daleks in Manhattan, I think he directed that.
That's the one. Yes, he is not afraid to to show off really abstract and strange angles.
Yeah.
Jamie Childs is great at blows, things like that. They Rachel Talalay is a master at lighting and atmosphere as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you get directors like Nick Horan, who I think like almost all of the episodes he directed, they're kind of directed very differently. Like I was in my head, because Nick Horan is probably one of my favourite directors of the Revive series, and I just trying to think of kind of certain motifs that he uses. I can't really think of any. I think he's kind of quite unique in terms of the stories he uses. Like The Girl Who Waited, it kind of feels very different in a directing sense to The God Complex. But yeah, I think once you look at directors' work, you start to see patterns, like with Graham Harper, the kind of epic zoom-ins that you only really get with his stories. And yeah, I just think it's great, and obviously, yeah, it's just really nice to pick up on these things visually, and also I think Series 11 and 12 helped with putting the director credit in the opening titles as well, kind of really highlighting that, yeah, that is a really important job, and these people just deserve a lot of recognition for it. And like when an episode looks so crisp and beautiful, it can be a really satisfying thing to watch. So yeah, it's just great.
Yeah, like The Ghost Monument it's like half of the story it would be if it wasn't directed by Mark Tonderay.
Absolutely, I'd agree. That like opening bit is so strong from a directorial sense, and if you gave that to another director, you can imagine that being kind of a very boring, kind of just crashing scene. But because you give it to Mark Tonderay, who has like a kind of one take, very shaky and manic kind of directorial style, it just adds so much more to that scene.
Yeah, and it's not just a long take for the sake of a long take, but it's also, it gives that spaceship a real sense of place. How, I forget the character's name, but it's the guy who's in that race. and he actually like goes to the floor of the spaceship, opens up the bottom of it, and pulls Kit out of the space. It feels like a lived-in place, and the long take just further emphasizes that. It doesn't feel like a set because of that long take.
Absolutely. I think long takes have actually been used quite well in Doctor Who, because I was thinking back to the Bells of St. John, where there's kind of like a long take sequence when the Doctor and Clara go in through the TARDIS all the way around the circumference of the console and go back out, and it's on the plane, and that's a brilliant shot, and obviously it does serve a purpose because you're seeing the dimensions of the TARDIS and also admiring just the brilliant symmetry of that brilliant TARDIS set, and then you're back out, and it kind of, if I was to think of a shot that really sums up Doctor Who, well, not really a shot, but like a directorial sequence that really sums up everything that Doctor Who has to offer, it would be that, where you go through, go all the way around the TARDIS, you go back out, you're in a different place, Clara's there, just holding a mug of tea, just like spilling it everywhere, panicking, and that kind of mundane to the very extreme, and that kind of anything, anywhere premise, I think it's just really summed up in that kind of sequence. But yeah, I just agree that the Doctor Who directors have been great and kind of unsung heroes of so many stories. I guess we're kind of, I'm gonna wrap it up now because it's 2 hours and 20 minutes, this raw recording. But yeah, it's been such a pleasure having you on, Mr. TARDIS. It's been great talking to you about just general Doctor Who chat. It's been really good. It's made my evening, and yeah, just thank you for coming on, because obviously I'm not a big YouTuber in the slightest, and I've never really done this before, so it's just so great that you kind of took the leap and came on. I'm really thankful of that.
No, well, thanks so much for asking. Thanks so much for. I think it was a really interesting conversation. I think we disagree with a few things, but I think we both want we both want to support the show and what's best for the show, and to be constructive and productive about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, in a time where a lot of people find it hard to have conversations about Doctor Who in terms of what they agree with and disagree with, I think it's so great that we can disagree on things but just have a civilized conversation. Certain people seem to not really understand that, but yeah, it's been so great having you on, and yeah, I myself just enjoy talking to people about different opinions, because obviously it's no good just being sat in an echo chamber with your own opinion, but you know, it's important for people to talk to different people with different opinions and kind of explain their side of it, and just have a good old-fashioned debate, which is always great. But yeah, it's just been so nice.
I think because there's a few YouTubers who I disagree with in terms of what they think of the show, like Stu Bagfull. I love his videos, disagree with quite a few of them, but because I know he's approaching the series from a good place and in good faith. And I think that's the distinction here. Yeah,
obviously there are certain individuals that I'm not going to name on the podcast, but you certainly know who they are, that, you know, having a conversation with them would just not really get anywhere, because it's kind of less, like, some people are so fixed in a certain mindset, which isn't really criticism, that it's just very hard to even really approach them. But I just think it's really nice to have a conversation with you. Yeah, we disagree on a few things, but it's just great to just have that discussion. And yeah, it's been great. And next time on the podcast, I don't know if you know the YouTuber Richard Lloyd, but I'm getting him on the podcast, and his favourite era is the Capaldi era, and obviously, as I've mentioned, I'm not a big fan of the Capaldi era, but so it'll be interesting to have that discussion. But to have a discussion, just have a friendly debate, like no one needs to be calling people names or just getting very annoyed and just all that stuff. It's just completely unnecessary, and obviously there is a lot of toxicity in the Doctor Who fandom. There has been for a while, but I think it's why it's so important
but
to
just
have these
to bring it back around from where we started the conversation, like someone, like, no matter what era of the show it is, it's going to be someone's favorite.
Absolutely.
And it just shows how big and vast and diverse a show like Doctor Who can be, and that's representative in its fan base as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone's going to have a different perspective, and sometimes debating that different perspective and coming at it from different angles and seeing someone else's perspective is the most interesting thing about having debates with people. And yeah, it's just been so great, just generally having you on. As I said, you've been a big inspiration, and just having this chat and just you coming onto the podcast. I'm so grateful for you for coming in and having a chat. So yeah, thank you for coming on. Is there any?
I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, is there anything you wanna plug on the podcast?
Oh, let me get my list out. You've already mentioned the Doctor Who Perfect Shots account, which is on Twitter at DW Perfect Shots. You can also follow me on Twitter normally at TRILBYreviews. And I've also recently started a podcast with my fiance where we talk about horror films. That's the Monster Monday podcast. That's on Spotify. That is on iTunes. That is on Anchor, Google Podcast, etc. You can follow me on YouTube at MrTARDISreviews, all one word. And one of the upcoming things I've got happening is a big marathon review series dropping this December. That's a sequel to my Daleksember review marathon from last year. And I've also got an upcoming Doctor Who audio drama, a 13th Doctor audio drama called The Collateral of Ivanhoe. It's a one-off story, 50-minute story with the Doctor, Yaz, Graham and Ryan getting involved in essentially a futuristic bank heist, a bank robbery that goes way too far. And that's about halfway edited. Really looking forward to what people think about that. And that's kind of everything I need to plug, I think.
Yeah, I'm certainly excited to see your future projects. And yeah, anyone who isn't following Mr. TARDIS or doesn't know who he is, I don't know why, because probably if you're clicking on this video, you would know who Mr. TARDIS is, but if you don't, just go check him out, because he is honestly such a pillar in this community, and he's one of the kind of mainstays of Doctor Who reviewing, because obviously you've been doing it since 2010, I believe, so...
Yeah, over 10 years, blimey.
Yeah, mental. So you've been doing it a while. You're kind of one of the OG YouTube channels that I don't even know if I know anyone who's been doing it as long as you. So you're kind of like the grandfather of Doctor Who reviewing.
I will say, don't watch my older stuff. My older stuff is mostly pants. Bad audio quality, sometimes some bad arguments. But I'm moving forward and trying to get better and everything. But yeah, I've been doing it for 10 years. If you need like an introduction to my stuff, go into the playlist of my channel and watch Daleksember. That's 25 reviews and 25 days of classic and revived series Dalek stories.
Yeah, it's a great series, your Daleksember series, and I'd slightly disagree with you. I'd say still check out your older stuff, because I think you've just been consistently great, and yeah, just go check out Mr. TARDIS, and you'll have hours of weeks of fun there, looking through all his videos, his back catalogue. And if you have no social life, which most Doctor Who fans don't, then just spend your summer holidays just watching Mr. TARDIS videos. I can't think of a better way to spend your time. But
thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you for coming on the podcast, as I've said, and it's been a great discussion. So thank you for
I've enjoyed it, really.
Yeah, and thank you for everyone who's still here at this point, watching or listening, whatever, and thank you for watching this video. I'll see you guys next time, and I'll see you, Mr. TARDIS. Thank you for coming on.
Cheers, thanks so much for having me. Thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah, thank you guys, and goodbye.